Yo, what is going on, my fellow weebs? Chrono here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we have the faded bow interview. Now, I know you guys have been waiting a while for this one. I apologize, but we've had some things that popped up in the way. Things have changed. So what we're actually doing is we're actually doing a re-recording of the bow interview. This is going to be fresh with new information, all the recent changes. So you guys are going to get a fresh perspective on where bow is at after all of the changes with the PA customizations and all that good stuff. But in case this is your first of these videos or you're new to the channel, hey, I'm Chrono. I primarily do PSO2 content, and what we're actually doing at the moment is interviewing some of the top end players in their respective classes and weapons. The idea here is that we want to pull back the veil on some common misconceptions that players have about individual classes. A lot of times optimization isn't something everyone jumps into, and when someone is trying to make a point or is talking about a specific topic, it doesn't really make sense to that individual if they don't understand the background behind it. The idea here is that we bring some players together that have put in that sort of time, that put in that effort, that do understand it, and that want to go ahead and talk with you guys about it. That way you can learn a bit more about the class, and you kind of get their perspective when you see someone, saying, hey, look, this isn't great, or this is amazing, or this isn't, this is terrible, so on and so forth. But I'm not going to go too much further into that. There should be an entire playlist full of these interviews, and we may evolve them as we go along, maybe change them up or do some revisits. So just stay tuned. So if you want to just toss us up in the background and continue doing whatever it is you're doing, by all means, feel free. But I have talked for long enough. Let's go ahead and bring Chumbo on the line here with us. So just one moment. All right. So I got Chumbo here with us. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and we can go from there.
How's it going? I'm Chumbo. Some of you might know me from the official Discord and from Fleet as that psycho that says buff bow a lot. I'm a bow only player in NGS. I've played it since it came out. I think that was like August of the year that NGS released, and I've only played pure bow since then, doing like as many time attack things as I can with the weapon by itself to kind of really push it as far as I can. I have a couple achievements, I guess you could say, under my belt that are always bow only. Stuff like I was one of the only 2 bow players to solo Stia Purple before Slayer was released. One of the only 2 to solo Darkfall's Solus before Flugel was released. I do a lot of ARCS records, and I always post videos on them. I'm one of the guide co-writers with Undine. We write the bow guide together. He's since kind of put bow playing on like hold to swap to Slayer to push times, but he still contributes like numbers and stuff. I contribute a lot of like the gameplay stuff for the guide, and we keep that updated as much as we can. And my 2 recent most like relevant achievements is I was the only person to have a pre-Glan Gigas Mest MDFA solo with bow, and I got just recently a sub 14 Dalian duo without a ranger with a friend of mine.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, that was a fun one. That fight drives me up the wall, but it was satisfying getting it.
I'm thinking of like Dalian right now and thinking how annoying that has to be, since the whole ad situation, which we'll talk about later. I'm curious about it, so we'll definitely talk about that. But yeah, that's pretty awesome. So it's safe to say that you've probably pushed bow to its absolute limit, and maybe then some.
Yeah. It's a bit of a hyperfixation at this point.
As a man who has his hyperfixation, of course, in soaring blades, I understand. I get where you're coming from, but I feel like you may have even more of a hyperfixation on your weapon than I might even have on mine, though my hyperfixation transcends games at this point. So it's totally understandable. I actually was curious. So your history with PSO2. So you mentioned, playing bow and getting into and everything like that. Does your history predate NGS in any way or anything like that?
So I didn't actually play base PSO2 when I did for like briefly, like a week or 2 when it got released on global, but like that was back when like all the information was only available in like Japanese, and prior to that being released, I didn't even know Phantasy Star Online 2 existed. So like I hopped into this brand new game and I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing, and all of these guides are in a language I can't read, so I'm just going to stop playing because this hurts.
Yeah, there was a lot of work for us to do back then. There was a lot of work to be done, so I totally understand.
So I came back to the game once I heard about NGS and I started playing. I basically started like actually playing the game in NGS. I've since then gone back to play base. I've like leveled braver. I've gone back to base to be able to kind of understand how base bow plays in comparison to NGS. So I've like leveled braver to 100, leveled some classes to 100, done a whole bunch of other stuff and all that to really understand that game as well. And while it's not to the depth as I understand bow in NGS, I think I have a decent enough grasp, and I read a lot of information on it anyway. But yeah, I've pretty much stuck entirely to NGS, only hopping over to base occasionally.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that's like a huge, like, I like to say I don't have like pet peeves. I just have these major just annoyances. Like there's not a lot of things that bother me, but they just drive me up a wall. And one that happens all the time, and one that I enjoy about these interviews is like pulling back the veil on like common misconceptions or things that people just like, I feel like they just remember wrong. And a very common thing that happens is like people like to speak of base game in a very specific way. And I'm like, I played it. That's completely incorrect. Like that is not how that happened at all. Or nor like they're like, there's this hyperfixation. I mean, this is a little bit off topic, of course, already going off topic, and we're less than 10 minutes in. But this hyperfixation on Katana being like this super in-depth weapon back in base game, and I was like, no. I hear you guys, but by the time we were done, it was mostly 4 PAs that you used, and it was mostly just how good you were with reaction time, as well as dealing with incoming stuff. Like there was a bit of planning involved, absolutely. There was like a combo that existed at a point in time, but it was like 2 PAs back to back over and over again, and then you just didn't do that combo, and another thing came up. I was like, nah, that's just not the case. So it's good. It's really cool to hear that you actually went back and played base game bow, because I feel like the one thing that I'm sure you probably have heard is, well, back in base game, it was like this. And it's like, you can actually now experience it and know what it was actually like. Because, man, Skull's always mentioned that people tell her like that, oh, you know, things like this in base game and things like that in base game. And I'm like, that they weren't like that at all. They're just telling you that because you didn't play, and like you can't check them on it, because they won't tell that to me. Like I'll mention things and they're like, oh, I didn't know you played. I was like, yeah. This is like thousands of hours, good friend, thousands of hours. But yeah, no, that's a long way of saying it's cool that you actually went back and you checked out base bow and things like that. So you have like a cooler perspective on it, at least I think personally.
And I try to stay open. Like I understand like what they're going for with that. And when we get to that section, I'll kind of go more in depth on that. But I know people that have interacted with me in some of the Discords probably know I have a very large distaste for base bow, but I will try to shelve that for this just to kind of give more like effective.
You know, to be fair, I played base bow as well a little bit. I like NGS bow better, I'm gonna be honest. And that's just as someone who didn't take it super in depth, picking up the weapon and playing it, just to me it felt a bit better. Damage numbers maybe not there, but it felt a bit better. But again, we'll get to that when we get to that. So not to delay the beginning of this, I'm sure tons of people want to get into this one, because this interview has been delayed long enough as it is, between all the life things going on with me recently, and then just general changes in the game that I guess they decided to push right when I started these interviews. The game was static for a long time, and then I start interviews and all of a sudden just massive changes are coming out. So make my life more difficult as always. This is actually the second time we're recording this for those of you guys who are watching. I mentioned in the intro. So Chumbo and I've had a chance to talk about this beforehand, and there are things that I've already heard, and I'm sure there's some new things I haven't heard about, but we're going to go, make sure that we kind of have an understanding of everything that's talked about. So to mention some things that I basically already understand or know about, or some terminology and things like that, but it'll be explained a bit more for those of you guys who maybe aren't, bow mains, that are just kind of curious about how bow plays. Maybe you're looking into playing bow in the future, or maybe you just want something to listen to in the background as you're just mindlessly farming deck space. Who knows? So yeah, just as a kind of a heads up. And if I seem familiar, it's because I am. And there might be some massive changes I don't know about. So who knows? We'll get into them. I didn't have Chumbo brief me at all on any of this stuff. So we'll talk about it when we get there. So to start things off, when it comes to it, we're gonna start with some strengths. I like to start in a positive light, because I feel like those who are passionate about their weapon can think of every possible thing that needs to be changed. So let's talk about what bow does well. Doesn't have to be the best, just something you think about whenever you pick up bow, like, man, I'm glad I'm playing bow for this specific reason, or whatever it happens to be.
So I had done this last time as well. Like at the very start, I had kind of brought up this point that I said was both a positive and a negative for bow. It was I said it was a positive and negative, but it's a core part of bow's kit that kind of like is what it's designed around. So I don't think it's a bad thing that it exists. I do want to stress, I'm just going to say it right now, guys. This 2 hours is going to be a lot of me crying into this microphone about this weapon. But under no circumstances, I don't think this weapon is designed poorly. I think it's a really well-designed weapon. I think it's just lacking. I mean, obviously, it's lacking damage in like pretty much every spot in its kit, but it's just kind of there's like some very small things that make it clunkier than it needs to be. But the entire kind of like design philosophy of the weapon is fine, in my opinion. I think they had a game plan when they made this weapon, and they got it almost there, but they kind of just stopped after a while. I think that also coincides with the whole Kavaris thing 2 years ago. But
yeah. So I mean, it sounds like that at the very least, design wise, is a good positive for us. Like the weapon is. It may not hit when it comes to numbers tuning, but like when it comes to actual, like, I guess, feel or mechanics, I guess you could use, like, that's definitely there, which is a stark contrast to how I felt about my weapon for a very, very long time. So and I would argue that I feel like this is a better place to be than the other side of things, but we gotta hope for the second half, you know. But I'll let you keep going. Yeah, so go ahead.
So the main mechanic about bow is that it's basically a charge focused weapon. You want to charge your photon arts. Well, you don't want to all the way. That's kind of what I'm getting at. It has charges on its PAs, but unlike other weapons with charges, or like how base bow worked, where when you charged a PA on base bow, it didn't really do anything mechanically different. You just basically like probably either shot the arrow faster, you maybe added a few extra arrows onto it, and it just did more damage if you charged. In NGS, when bow charges a PA, it effectively changes the entire property of the PA. So you have Flex Arrow, which has 3 stages. You have uncharged, charged, supercharged. And then you have the other 3 PAs being Firework, Ceaseless, and Dimensional Ray. Those have 2 stages on uncharged and charged. So you effectively have 9 photon arts on this weapon that all do completely different things. And it's not always the case that a charged PA is stronger than an uncharged PA. The easiest example for this is like on something like Bujin, since Geolab was last week, it's pretty relevant, but like charged Flex Arrow is the shot where bow will just like shoot a straight arrow that will pierce up to 5 times on a target. If it's only piercing 2 times instead of like 3 is usually the cutoff for it being a worthwhile shot. If it's only piercing 2 times, you probably were better off using an uncharged PA on a different move. And then also something like charge ceaseless on an enemy that you know is going to hit you is going to get you hit, and you're going to have a very large like dip in the damage you're dealing instead of just using an uncharged move. Bow plays around a lot with like knowing what charge stages it can reach and whether those charge stages are even worth reaching in the scenario. And that's why I say it's a plus and a minus. It adds depth to the weapon because you have so many options for the stuff that you're doing, but it also requires a lot of know-how on like what you can fit and how they interact with the enemy that you're fighting. Yeah, so that's why I say it's a plus and a minus.
It sounds a lot like depth, basically. It adds a lot of depth that really wouldn't be there otherwise, but it can also suffer from the amount of depth that it adds. So I can see how that's kind of like a positive and a negative. I feel like it errs more on the side of positivity of keeping you engaged at the very least.
Yeah.
So I feel like a bit more rewarding. But like, yeah, I'd imagine if you charge up a shot that's supposed to pierce 3 times, it pierces twice, and you're like, I could have just not done that. That's got to kind of hurt. For sure.
Yeah, and it gives you, it's like rich gameplay. It lets you have a lot of decision making for the weapon and like figuring out when we get to crafts, let me tell you, the new crafts are like you need like a PhD in mathematics for a lot of this stuff.
I heard a lot of things changed with some of those crafts. Like we talked about crafts before because I think we had like 1 at the time. And now we
Yeah.
got a second one. So I heard Bo was eating good, but like it almost sounded a little sarcastic, as in like Bo's eating good, but like at what cost, sort of thing. So I'm actually curious
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that, believe me. But another positive I wanted to get to, attack impact. That's a mechanic that Bo has where it fills up a gauge on landing its PAs. Um, Obviously, hitting like better PAs fills your gauge faster. Like piercing 5 times with a flex arrow will fill your gauge faster than piercing 1 time, stuff like that. But what it does is once you fill your gauge, you can press normal attack. It gives you this little pink ring around yourself. And when that pink ring is up, your next photon art does 25% increased damage. That, when you combine with stuff like charged ceaseless draw, you have a lot of spots now where your charged ceaseless draw is now stronger than your counter, which is pretty contrary to everyone's whole Counter-Star Online thing. So Bo has a lot of situations where its PAs are stronger than its counter, which leads to a lot of situations where even when you're soloing and you're not under long range advantage, you will avoid a counter to get a stronger PA off. Stuff like that. That isn't super apparent in a lot of other classes and weapons at the moment, where a lot of people are just kind of going for as many counters as possible. So it's just another, you could say it's a negative because, you know, it's going through all these hoops for still less damage, but it's a lot of like, I think, healthy gameplay depth. It's like a interesting weapon to learn all these kinds of ins and outs.
I feel like that's
Um,
going to be a conversation that happens a lot, though, is like damage. So you guys are going to hear the spoiler alert: the damage is bad. It's low.
yeah.
Spoiler. That's just so you guys are aware of where this conversation is coming from. I feel like that or perspective would be helpful there. And we're not
Yeah.
saying you can't do good damage with it. We're saying comparatively to everything else in the game, when you're looking at the numbers are low.
Yeah.
Similar to when we talked about force. The numbers are
Yeah.
low, almost laughably. So you hear, oh, cool, extra depth. That's pretty awesome. My brain immediately thinks is like, how bad is your counter? Like that you don't. Whether this can do more damage. Like either that's really really good, or that counter is not that great. So,
Yeah.
but again, sure, we're gonna get into that itself. But I just wanted to make that, like, I feel like that level of context is kind of important there. But go on.
Mhm. So then another kind of strength, it has like I mean, I guess you could say decent enough skill floor. Like Bo with long range advantage, as much as I hate it, it's reasonable to pick up and play because you can now kind of just stand back and press one button. Kind of they're pushing range gameplay into a lot of that one button gameplay. You could consider that a positive or a negative, however you look at it. Next, the weapon, like I mentioned with the 9 PAs, it's a very flexible weapon. I think that's something that Bo is very strong at. Because it has 9 PAs, it has a tool for every situation. Bo can kind of functionally do everything in the game. Like no matter what the game throws at you, Bo can still do something in it. Where there are other weapons where it's like, you throw me in an AoE situation and I don't know what to do because my weapon doesn't AoE. Stuff like that. If you throw an aggressive boss onto me, I can handle it. If you throw a slow boss onto me, I can handle it. If you throw duo bosses onto me, I can handle it. Like Bo is good at being able to kind of do whatever the game asks of it. And it has like a very full kit that like allows it to do that. Between its 9 PAs, it has a standing and a moving counter, 2 types of normals, the alter normal from attack impact, gauge building, active cooldowns, precasts, stack management. It's got everything you could want for an individual weapon to be a full weapon, to be able to kind of do everything in the game.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of funny because it almost feels like, and this might be why this mindset has come up or has been around for a long time, that braver feels unfair, but you sound like kind of the ranged version of what I look at when I look at Katana.
Yeah.
You have an answer to every single situation, and as a melee player, as someone who played primarily melee weapons, throwing blades, I look at Katana and I'm like, I know you don't have as much damage. I hear you. But like you have a lot of situations I would love to be able to use to deal with incoming damage.
Yeah.
Like a lot of tools. And I'm thinking to myself, like the holy or the golden standard. Maybe the damage in there, but the golden standard of mechanics, I feel like are there, which I didn't really pick up on this when we last talked about it, but I feel like that might also lead to like the community perception of, and again, no spoiler alert, the community perception of like Braver, and I say this in quotations, Braver being broken. That's not. I'll be real with you guys, and I'm gonna toot my own horn. I crush Bravers on the daily, and it's not even their own fault. They're playing well, like, and I'm spamming a PA, dude, and I'm crushing it. So like, let's not get it twisted. But yeah, when you talk about it like that, it's like, okay, that's cool. Like you have an answer to just about everything, but like it's not all sunshine and rainbows. So yeah, it just dawned on me when you were saying it, and I was like, that actually kind of tracks. That makes a lot of sense.
So a couple more strengths. I'm kind of reaching for some of these just so that I'm not being all doom and gloom, I guess.
Hey, it's totally fine if there are more negatives and positives. I don't think anything is going to beat Mitch and the Force interview. I think we had maybe 2 positives, and they were like kind of hopium positives, and the rest were just like, this is just despair. So I feel like you can still talk positive about your weapon, even if it is about its weaknesses. So don't stress it too hard on that one. I'm cool with that.
So it's usually Braver's burst option if you're playing hybrid Braver, but it's not, when compared to other weapons with burst, it's not very much. It's just like the best option that Braver has, and it's not really even burst. Bow's full down rotation takes like almost 25 seconds that you need the boss to like not be attacking, which is like something you are almost never going to happen. So you have to shave off parts of it. And even like different bosses have different breaks, like MDFA's break was extremely fast, stuff like that, where you can't do everything that Bow wants to do on a down, but it's still like tends to be the better option burst wise for Braver. But there are also times where Katana still just beats it out anyway. Another strength, it's range that I think is a plus and a minus in this game. It has like, for stuff like mining rig, Bow is okay. It can grab aggro on stuff, where grabbing aggro is more important in mining rig than being able to kind of kill stuff just because you pull them off the rigs to like reduce stress, stuff like that. Bow, yeah, it's fine. It's ranged. It can grab the aggro. Other strengths, Bow's charged normal attack when you shoot it into a mob can refill your entire PP bar because it hits multiple enemies and it's normal attack. It has pre-fire options, which is a thing. Bow has, well, this is actually kind of going to come up a second time. It now has 2.5 pre-fire options as opposed to having 3. In the first interview, it had 3 pre-fire options.
Yeah, I thought it had more.
Changes. It's now down to 2.5. So it kind of got a little bit of a nerf there.
That 0.5. Oh, you know what? I know exactly what that 0.5 is, and yeah, we're gonna talk. I thought about it. I was like, I know what that 0.5 is now. We'll get there.
So next, Brave Combat Finisher is like all right, especially if you use it as a pre-fire. I wasn't counting that as a pre-fire option, by the way. So you could say 3.5, I guess. But Brave Combat Finisher, if you use it as a pre-fire, is all right. And it also fully fills Bow's AI gauge, so it's very good for hybrid as like an on-demand fill on your AI gauge to allow for like an AI ceaseless. And it's decent AoE. Like it's one of the more useful moves Bow has in like GeoLab last week, using Brave Combat to like nearly wipe out an entire wave on floor 2. It's a useful enough button, but I will get into why I don't particularly like Brave Combat.
that's something Brave Combat's very weird. I thought it was something different before I talked to you guys, but I learned how it actually works, and I don't understand. That's something we'll talk about when we talk about possible changes for Braver, because I honestly feel like that does need some tweaking. But yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, kind of like all these strengths I'm giving, just imagine there's like a little asterisk at the end of them saying this will be brought up in the negatives as well.
Yeah, it's not that simple, unfortunately.
Being ranged, like I mentioned, gives uptime on some fights where you're ranged, you can hit the boss more. But again, that'll be back in the weaknesses. Bow's Photon Blast is decent. It does good damage, and it also fully refills your AI gauge. But it again comes with some negatives in terms of like its hitbox and its piercing properties and all that, which causes you to more often than not hit which you don't want to hit. Like I always remember if you somewhere on the bow guide, I think Ondine had a gif of using Bow's Photon Blast. I think it was on Doldoris in the Stia Purple, and he was downed. His battery is exposed. He's laying there, and he's like a mile in the air charging the Photon Blast directly at the battery, and then the entire thing just hits the drill instead. Like it's a clear as day shot on the battery, and it just hits the drill instead because the hitbox and the piercing, it just makes it so unlikely to hit what you want to hit, especially from a range.
Sounds like you know my good friend Pinion Blade.
Yeah, Pinion Blade.
Yes, where we can hit behind us accidentally, because that makes sense. And I'd like to go ahead and further provide you one. Those who know, they know. But anyway.
Another strength, it has an evade counter instead of a block counter, so you can abuse lingering hitboxes with it. And really reaching for the bottom of the barrel, Braver Optimization, that skill that it got back in Stia, you can now build the cheaper option between melee and range when you want to gear for a bow because Braver's skill.
I mean, everything's expensive these days, so like I feel like
so you
people
still
are
lose.
enjoying
And
that.
we're at like the point where everyone's like all the good augments are tri-stat anyway, so it doesn't even matter there.
Yeah, it's all potency, so you really can't get a whole lot going on there. But hey, I mean, it was nice for a while.
It's something. And then this is something I'll talk about the changes that had happened because there was a recent actually I should just talk about them now. So like the recent patch where there were new crafts, they pushed out some other changes alongside the crafts. So everyone got their fourth crafts, but then they did bow specific changes, and then they did one hilariously tragic change as well. So that tragic one is they nerfed Encore Jump. That I'll explain that later. But then the other bow specific ones both affected Dimensional Ray. For people unfamiliar, uncharged Dimensional Ray is you press the button and then either at like if you're in over the shoulder mode, it'll go to wherever you're aiming. If not, it'll do it either on your target or just in front of you. If you're not targeting something, you make a circle and you do an arrow rain on that circle for a couple seconds. They updated that to now, it used to take about 8 seconds for the entire PA to finish. So you would have to have the enemy stand inside this rain for 8 seconds to get its full damage off. They sped up the rate at which it ticks. They didn't add any more ticks, they just sped up the rate. So now it takes only about like 4 seconds to do its entire damage. It's the same amount of damage as before, it just happens half as fast, or well, double as fast. So that was one of the changes that they did. And then the other change for bow specific was charge Dimensional Ray. For people that don't know, when you charge Dimensional Ray, you get like this little blue ribbon around yourself and you stock 5 like invisible arrows on yourself. And then the next 5 times you land a photon art on an enemy, you kind of shoot an extra arrow at them. They made that, they sped that up basically where like the period of time between your photon art hitting something and then the extra arrow landing, that got like drastically sped up. So now it's like almost instant where like you hit and then the arrow hits, where before there would be like a brief delay before the arrow hit. So those were the 2 bow specific changes they did. And then they also nerfed Encore Jump and released the crafts. So I wanted to say for the strength, what I was getting at was of all of those things, the charged Dimensional Ray one, where just that arrow, that single bonus arrow things are faster, that's just like a completely good change. There's nothing negative about it, unlike the other changes. It's just it's not a damage buff or anything, it just kind of removes a lot of the clunk with the move, so it's just better. Like there's nothing bad that came out of that.
Yeah, it's not really a damage buff to the skill itself. Well, it's, to be technical, it's technically a DPS increase because it's the same amount of damage in a shorter period of time, but it does increase the actual damage of the overall skill. So yeah, for sure. Also, frick
That's
Encore Jump, but that's just me. I apologize. I know. Listen, I bow. I apologize. I'm very sympathetic for your loss of Encore Jump, but it deserved it anyway. We'll get to that, guys. Some of you guys have your pitchforks out. Relax. I'm on your side. I swear. There is more to it, and we'll talk about it. So I'm not gonna like hold on to you and string you about all the strengths. If you can't think of any more, that's fine.
that was
but if
it.
there's okay, I was like, I feel like you're hitting the real bottom of the barrel here. Right about the time that we hit the skill back in, I think what was it? Was it Kavaris when they added in that skill for the multi-stat thing? I was like, I think he's really scraping the bottom of the barrel here. But hey, I appreciate as much as you did there. So I mean, like, it does have some good strengths, right? Like, I feel like it's hard to call them strengths because the thought of the word strength means usually refers to power and strong, when that's not how those work. But there are positives. There are positive sides. We'll put it that way. Now here we go into probably the next hour and a half of this video. Let's talk about the negatives. Let's talk about the problems where being a bow main can be a bit difficult. And why we feel this specific way and how it applies to the game overall. There's going to be a lot of this, so strap in. Again, you guys should see some gameplay kind of roll in the background, so you guys will be able to see some of the stuff we're talking about. Again, it's not specific to what's being said, but you can kind of get a bit of an idea as we're going along. But wherever you want to start with this process, the floor is yours.
So I first want to start this section with two things. One, kind of from those previous like recent changes I had mentioned, the dimensional array, the removal of Encore Jump, and the new crafts. They added some stuff. They definitely took away stuff from bow. The stuff that they added, and people might hate me for saying this. I understand if you hate me. I know people don't really agree fully in different areas, but I am going to say it after like kind of looking through all of the results, all of like the ARC's records, Braver as a class's contribution to team play, to utility, to solos of Dark Fallses, to co-op Dark Fallses, all of that. These changes weren't enough for me to say, well, they basically what I'm getting at, bow is the worst individual weapon in the game. I don't think that this is really up for debate anymore. I think the two competitors alongside of it were Talus and Launcher. And I think that despite bow kind of having a bit of an edge over those two in solo bossing, they bring much more to the table in more areas of the game than bow does. Braver's not a very good class right now. It usually places like 6th out of 10. And despite being very below average, it still doesn't want to ever use bow. The weapon doesn't do anything. It brings nothing to the table. So no. You can hate me all you want for that, but I think that the kind of results really speak for themselves here. The weapon doesn't do anything.
To be fair, keep in mind that worst weapon in the game doesn't mean least amount of damage. That's something that people tend to kind of immediately correlate with the two of them. Like, I would argue that force has a play here because of how bad they are, but they still bring something to the table. Depending upon the situation you're in. Forces can still proc elemental downs in a situation where no one else can. Forces can still provide a bit of extra healing to everyone in a radius. Not that forces specifically go for doing that as much as they want, but that is still something they can bring to the table. When you said what Braver can bring to the table or Braver utility, my first thought was what utility? Why do I want a Braver? There's almost no reason. So that's something to keep in mind as far as context goes. I know people are going to have that mindset and, you know, maybe you're upset or whatever, but like, I want to say force, but like when you really look at it, I have to agree. There is nothing, like literally nothing.
I do have this sheet as well. People have probably seen it by now. It's comparing solo clears of bow versus rod. And you can see in pretty much, it dates all the way back to like, when did it go back to? It was like the end of Kavaris where they started like redoing the Retem and Aleo purples, like back when Katana was in its Katana phase, dating back to there, going through every time that Force soloed something and Bow soloed something. And since then until now, and this is including all of those all falls solos like Solus, MDFA, Dark Falls rank 2, I think, is on there. I don't remember. And then also Arcs Records. Bo has won a total of 3 times since then. For 2 years now, Bo has won 3 times.
Oh, it's
So
obviously just a skill issue. Like, just the horses
yeah.
are just feel better, right? But nah, sure. but yeah, it's pretty bad.
And I do want to get out of the way right now. I, under no circumstances, am saying I don't think Force needs help. I absolutely think Force needs help. I completely recognize that it's a full class where Bow is an individual weapon. But I do want to just kind of dispel this idea that Bow is somehow better than other classes and weapons and stuff, where there is legitimate proof, like statistical evidence that it's not only is it not the case, but it's never been the case.
They're all kind of bad. Like,
yeah.
You mentioned bad weapons, right? Like, and I know because I want to have a conversation with Kasumi in the future, because we didn't get a chance to talk until like we talked before the changes that happened with launcher and things like that. But like at the end of the day, you still have blight rounds. You still have the fact that you're a ranger. Like that still plays a part, and it still helps out a lot. And I mean, again, when it comes to Force, Talus, like people may have their misgivings, but it's an insanely good AoE weapon. And it's had a lot of really good changes that have popped up, but like
that's
I'm
really
really trying to think about it. I can't think of anything for Bo at all. I don't know.
That's like what I'm getting at. Like like I said, I don't like Talus doing bossing. Go ahead, buff the crap out of it so that Talus players can enjoy their weapon. I have no issue with that whatsoever. But the thing is that Talus just really has so many more applications in the game than Bo does. Like there were even times, I think, who was it? I think it was Boxes, a Ship 2 Slayer. They did I think it was Retem Purple, like the recent Retem Purple, where there's Slayer and they subbed Tector so that they could have the PB gain, and they also subbed Talus so that they could get an elemental down on Renus. So it's like you have Slayer subbing your weapon for the utility that it gives them in their solo, where Braver doesn't even want to use Bow half the time.
I would say it has an application. Not even that it has more applications. It just actually has. I think, that is a bit overstated in my opinion. The hybrid Braver does have applications for Bow, but from what I remember, it's like a 95% split. If even that. So like, yeah, I get where you're coming from. It's definitely a tough call for sure.
Yeah. So now to actually get into the weaknesses. And I also want to say that Bow requires a lot of trial and error to play optimally. I think it's kind of a nightmare with all of the moving parts in the weapon to play optimally. But I think it also makes it more like rich in gameplay, like I had said earlier. But it does, when trying to learn optimal Bow, it's very unwelcoming to kind of have to learn all of that stuff while also doing the very mediocre damage outside of that. Bow has pretty much all of its PAs are conditional, where you need to be meeting a condition for them to be doing their most, like their best output. So even if you're not meeting those conditionals, you're like a new player trying to learn how to optimize Bow, you're not meeting those conditionals, you are doing hilariously low damage compared to pretty much every other weapon. And then even when you are meeting those conditions, understanding what your weapon does, like you're getting those flex pierces, you're finding the ceaseless windows, you're successfully having the boss stand in dimensional ray for its full duration, you're still doing less damage. So that it's a hard weapon to get into, to have the mindset to get into knowing that, I think. And that despite that, though, I think that when you do well with the weapon, it feels really good to know you're doing well with the weapon, even if you just kind of pretend the rest of the game isn't there. Doing a good run on Bow just feels really good in my opinion. But yeah, it's a lot of math like a lot of math, especially with the new ceaseless craft. Bow takes just a ridiculous amount of math to understand like how to do stuff well on it. And because of the nature of its crafts, this is kind of like the most relevant weakness, I think, because it's
Mm-hmm.
now on 2 PAs. If you're not, most of Bow's crafts, it's not a case of I take the craft and if I'm not using it optimally, it's okay. It's still damage increase, but I'm just not doing as much as I could if I was doing it optimally. For Bow
Mm-hmm.
specifically, it's more of a case of if I'm not using the craft optimally, I'm actually doing less damage than if I hadn't taken a craft at all. So you have to be using the crafts optimally, like to mathematically be doing more damage. That's just how they function in this case.
Oh wow.
So like there are tons of times where like I'll be sitting there trying to figure out like what crafts do I use? Should I just not use a craft at all because I don't think any of these work well and I will lose damage if I'm not using them correctly. So yeah, that's the first weakness with Bow. The conditional nature of it and
Mm-hmm.
not being properly rewarded for those conditions. Moving on to that, just touching on the dimensional right change, how I had said it was also half negative. So the arrow rain now ticks over 4 seconds instead of 8. If you have type 2 dimensional array, that is extended to about like 7 seconds. It used to be like 13 before they
Mm-hmm.
changed it. If you remembered, I had said 0.5 on precasts. This is what I was talking about.
I see. Yeah.
So stuff like MDFA, a hand, a hand is about to come in and you're going to be able to start attacking the boss. You would throw down an arrow rain because you don't have time to use any of your other precasts. So you would throw down an arrow rain. It would tick once into nothing, tick again, tick again. The hand would come in and now you have like 7 more ticks on the hand.
Mm-hmm.
Now post update, the thing's coming in, you shoot dimensional array and it goes tick, 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 and then the hand comes in, and now you've only ticked like 2 times on the hand when you previously were ticking like 7 or 8. So the speed up on dimensional array, while it made it a lot more consistent, it also removed a lot of its precast applications. So that's a negative that came from this update, and why I say it wasn't all good, all bad for Bow.
Gotcha.
Now, kind of
Yeah.
going into the stuff we talked about last time, Brave Combat and how Braver's Burst is designed, I think, is really kind of unfortunate. Prior to Brave Combat refilling your attack impact, Braver needed to build its attack impact off of actually using Bow. So, like, when a boss goes down, you want to attack impact and then charge ceaseless on Bow when you're hybrid Braver because it does a lot of damage for Braver on a down. So it's like it's your best down option. So in order to get that attack impact, you had to actually play Bow. You had to use Bow to fill the gauge so you had the attack impact ready for the down. But at that point, you kind of would just use your precasts on Bow to fill your gauge and then just never touch Bow again until the boss goes down, because you would just sit on the full gauge and wait. Now, after Brave Combat refills your attack impact fully, you don't even have to do that. You literally just press Brave Combat and you get a full gauge on Bow, and then you just, like, you don't even have to do any of the stuff on it. You just get the full gauge for free. So now you're using the weapon even less than you already were to be prepared for the down phase. So I think that's a very unfortunate way that things kind of went, because there's just not much of a reason to use Bow outside of that, and Brave Combat refilling your attack impact kind of builds on that even more. So it's just unfortunate is really all I can say on that.
It's kind of funny. I want to say that it could have been either the last time we did this interview or it could have been with Gin. I'm not 100% sure. But I think we touched on that specifically about the fact that like the split for Bow, like it just isn't really there. Like you just aren't using it as much anymore. Kind of the positive of being able to get that build up. And honestly, I'm a little bit jealous of that as a Soaring Blades main, because our PB does not fill pinion at all.
Yeah.
I feel like we're the only class in the game that has a build up skill that their PB just doesn't fill it. I don't know why that's a thing. I feel like they kind of just forgot, because I also learned that for some reason, again, sidetrack, that's what we do here. For a while, I was like, cool. Pinion like generates PB or generates PP, and everyone's like, yeah, all build up skills did that, and I'm like, no, they didn't. We didn't do that. How long has it been like this? Why did no one tell me? Like, it's just those silly things. So it's like, I never really thought, like, looking back, I never thought about it as being like a negative thing. But yeah, you just don't have to play the weapon if you just switch. Well, it's kind of what I do with jet boots. I switch over, use a jet boots PB, or at least I did when I was using a multi weapon. You switch over, use the jet boots PB, and you get a free jolt. I don't have to play boots for that jolt. I
Yeah.
can just, whenever I get it, I just use it and then I move on with my life. But yeah, that's really interesting. That does kind of put in a place where it's like, oh, why even bother with the weapon?
Yeah.
That's kind of a bummer.
Like, it has this entire like robust kit for tons of things to do, and you just use it for one button. It's just whatever. Thinking about it is depressing.
Apologies. I didn't mean to harp on it for you there. But yeah, no, I just, to be fair, like it can, and I know there's probably some people that are like, oh, well, like if you want to play the weapon, you just play the weapon and it's fine. But like when you understand everything else that the game has to offer and what everyone else is able to do and that sort of thing, like I can totally get that. Like it feels kind of bad knowing that your weapon really doesn't have a place. Or like it's just like, oh, cool, you like, yeah, you can do some cool things with this weapon if you want to use it, you use it. But then like if someone's like, hey, why would I do this, and you're like, there's no reason, that sucks. Like realistically, that kind of sucks. So I totally understand that perspective. So yeah, no, it's totally fine.
Yeah. All right. So the next one, you've probably heard me mention it. Those PAs are hilariously low in damage, and this
Is
is something that I had brought up last time, and I also kind of wanted to add on to that because there was something I forgot to mention last time.
Mm-hmm.
I said look at the DPS last
Mm-hmm.
time, but when it comes to speed running, even more important than DPS tends to be just the raw potency value of the PA, because it becomes a situation of this boss does this move. How much potency can I fit into the window that's now available to me before it does its next move?
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
So yeah, for like stuff like Dark Falls Aegis, or MDFA, when he used like his chest blast, where like the walls come up on the side and he gets close and then shoots the big laser or a big blast in front of him, and then his core is exposed for a while.
Mm-hmm.
That always lasts the exact same amount of time every time he uses it. So you then kind of look through your kit to find what can I do during this time period that I can account for, like the swords that come midway through. What can I do before those swords? What can I do with those swords? And then what can I do after those swords? And when you look at the potency for a lot of Bo's PAs, they are all just really, really, really low for what they ask of you to do. Like flex piercing 5 times, which is like the most it can pierce, and it's not something you're going to be doing very often. Like the boss needs to be rather big for you to be piercing 5 times, and it's still just very low potency in general for like the time spent to cast it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Charge ceaseless, it does okay potency, but then you have to remember that it's like an almost 5-second cast that you can't even weapon action cancel out of. You have to step counter out of it if you're going to get hit, and Bo has like the 3rd weakest step counter in the game in terms of
Yeah.
potency. So, and on top of that, ceaseless, even though it does average damage, it's also 55% backloaded. So 55% of the entire damage of the PA is entirely in that final shot that it does. So if you're at any point cancel before you do that 55 backload, you basically just spent like almost 5 seconds doing hilariously low damage. And even if you had like don't cancel out of it,
Mm-hmm.
it's like it's still a projectile and a rather slow moving one in comparison to others, so you can completely just whiff it as well. Like again, I've been trying to do, well, I haven't done it recently, but I was doing like Retem Purple and Lizentos, especially
Mm-hmm.
when he goes red and the weak points on his head, he starts waving his head around, you're not landing ceaseless on that very reliably. So you're committing to this 5-second PA that doesn't do a lot of damage, and it also has the chance of doing even less damage. So just in general, those PAs just don't do the damage that they should when you consider what you need to do to be doing them.
And guys, I mean, and we looked at the numbers beforehand, and you guys know I'm a numbers guy, looking through spreadsheets, things of that sort. Hilariously low is not an like overstatement. Like literally, the high end of bow PAs is the low end of soaring blade like PAs, and I don't have to like charge or think or any of those things. I can press the button, and as long as I'm in range or I'm in the right spot and I'm not getting interrupted, like the worst of my worst is upwards of some of your best. Which again, that doesn't, it's not like an exact, comparison of how classes work. There's other things that are involved with it, and damage formulas and calculations that happen. But like, that's kind of what he's referring to when he mentions like hilariously low. It is legitimately hilariously low. Like if the dev team were to take bow and like across the board, just buff everything by about 50%, even if it wasn't like exactly correct, like I wouldn't be mad at them for it. Like I'd say 25% is like a conservative buff, because I'm always concerned when it comes to buffing things, as we've seen how bad that can turn when it comes to like jet boots at the moment, if you buff the wrong thing. But like if they were to say, hey, we're gonna buff everything by about 25% and it's for bow, I'd be like, that's fair. That's completely fine. I'm not mad at that. So yeah, it's bad. It's very bad.
Oh, right. The next one kind of ties into that as well. Especially in solo play, like Geolab again being the most recent ARCS record, it's the easiest to point to. You have Monkey and Bujin like on top of you. You want to use filler PAs because you don't have a lot of time between moves. Bow's 2 filler PAs, that's Uncharged Flex and Uncharged Ceaseless. For people that don't know them, Uncharged Flex is just like a single shot. It curves. You literally just shoot a shot and that's it. You do a little spin. Uncharged Ceaseless, your character kind of lunges in a direction really fast and then shoots a shot. That's stronger than Uncharged Flex. So it's like more damage for taking a little longer and it moves you. Both of those moves are both, even Uncharged Flex, are very slow for fillers and they're very weak. So when bow has aggro on it, it has a weak counter and it has weak fillers. So if it can't use its 2 like stronger PAs being Charged Flex and Charged Ceaseless, it will very quickly see itself kind of plummet because it just doesn't have the output with the tools that it is given at that point. Like Uncharged Flex, just mashing that, you're doing such little damage, and bosses don't give you the option to like not do that. And same with Uncharged Ceaseless is a little better. It's like, but it's still very kind of clunky to use, especially with like Monkey. If you use Uncharged Ceaseless, it does more damage than Uncharged Flex as your filler, but a lot of times you're moving yourself out of position for a counter by doing it. So stuff, and like if you're moving forward with, because you can choose your direction obviously. So if you move forward into the boss, sometimes you like are inside of his hitbox and now your projectiles are flying everywhere, but at the boss he's missing you and everything just goes real bad real fast. So just basically bow's fillers and its counters are just very weak, so it struggles when it has aggro, and just its PAs being low damage, it struggles when it doesn't have aggro. So there's not really any winning.
Yeah, it's losing agency over your movement or your positioning is pretty big, especially in games or in PSO2 where attacks aren't all made the same. They certain things, like you'd be surprised how often something will whiff just completely behind you. If you're just in a bit of a weird spot thinking you're going to be able to get it, versus you attacking through a target, which until doing like Geolab and a few other fights recently, like I didn't realize how often like something will just go directly through my target, like to the opposite side, even being melee. Like, dude, I'm point blank range. How is that even possible? So I can't imagine what it would be like for range when you're just shooting a shot and it's just going over the shoulder basically at this point. It's got to be ridiculous.
So really, I personally think it's a really interesting example of this. Shameless self plug, but if people are interested in watching that video, I do recommend it because I think it was a fun one to do. But a couple weeks ago, there was I don't remember the boss's name, the chicken.
Yeah,
that was the ARCS record. So that boss is obviously very you can manipulate its AI very easily. So
I
like
love chicken fight, dude. It's so good.
yeah, you can literally sit there and kind of map out the exact way that the fight is going to go from start to finish just because of how you can manipulate his AI. So he almost becomes like an MMORPG fight, like a Final Fantasy fight or something. So the boss is just going to stand completely still pretty much for the entire fight, and you're going to use fillers between each attack. So Bow, it's type 2 dimensional array, like I said. At that point, dimensional array hadn't been cut down on time. So type 2 dimensional array extended the reign from 8 seconds to like 13 seconds. So your first thought when you look at this boss that's standing still for the entire fight is, hey, I should take type 2 dimensional array because the boss is standing in the entire thing for the entire duration. And it does more damage than regular dimensional array because it has more ticks because it lasts longer. But the funniest thing about that is that actually wasn't the case. Mathematically, you didn't want to take type 2 dimensional array for that. You wanted to take type 3 dimensional array, which added more stacks onto like the arrow stocking you can do with charge dimensional array. And the reason for that is the chicken's kicks, you only had time to use 2 separate moves. You couldn't use ceaseless because it would move you. So the chicken's AI would break and he'd come after you and everything would get like messed up. So you only had 2 options, being uncharged flex and uncharged dimensional array. So uncharged dimensional array obviously does more damage than uncharged flex if the boss stands in it for the entire duration. The reason you didn't want to take type 2 is because if you took type 2, that was more time spent that you had to use uncharged flex instead of reapplying uncharged dim ray. And using uncharged flex at that point was a loss. So by taking like the faster reign, you're using a higher potency move more often.
I see.
Like uncharged flex is that weak that it ruins crafts from other PAs.
That's so weird. Yeah, I could. Yeah, because then you would need to get back into using dimensional array again faster. God, that's so. That hurts my brain to even think about.
There was a whole process for chicken, but that fight was interesting because of stuff like that, and it was really fun to do because just the rotations and all the kind of like little funny things Bo did. But that was like the biggest thing. Like, wait a second, type 2 is actually a bait here. even though it's literally the perfect fight for type 2 to exist, because my other option is uncharged flex, it's actually a loss.
It's not always that simple. That's pretty awesome. That is, yeah. I mean, like it again, I mentioned that it's like, oh, that kind of hurts my head to think about, but like it's kind of, I don't want to say it's kind of cool, but like,
yeah,
it is interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. It's like, oh, this is so comically bad that it actually messes with something else.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, that's interesting. That's neat.
Anyway, so next weakness, charged flex arrow. People kind of like look at charged flex as kind of like the bread and butter of the weapon. It's like Bow's charge shot. It's the one you'll see people using like the most often, unless they're abusing long range advantage and kind of like playing AFK ceaseless off in the distance. The issue with charge flex is that it's a pierce projectile, so it's only ever really doing like 50 to like 60% of its damage as weak point damage. For like example, if you're fighting like a Didal, its chest is exposed. It doesn't have its back core. That's something that happens very often. You shoot a flex into its chest, it pierces 5 times, but only like 2 or 3 of the pierces are actually weak points. So you're just randomly losing damage where like pretty much everyone else is doing full weak point damage onto the chest, and you're just cut. You just don't do as much by default because you're just not fully hitting the weak point for something that's not even in your control. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Funny you mentioned Didal specifically, because that is one of the targets that tends to hunch over, and it is an absolute nightmare for any rain projectiles, which I'm sure you know about. Because like, if I use Harrier and let the blade rain rock, it's gonna hit his head and do white damage numbers, which is awful.
Yeah. And then like that's also, for a different example, just for the sake of it, you have like MDFA or DFS, both very big bosses, and they have very big cores when they expose them. You shoot a charge flex into them, and you're piercing, you're doing 3 ticks, and then the last 2 ticks are hitting ones. Because just
one.
Yeah. Because the space between the pierces is so big that you just have half of the PA. Well, not half, because the last 2 are obviously less damage, but you have a decent chunk of the PA's damage just shaved off for no reason whatsoever, even though you're like on paper, I'm shooting the piercing projectile into the big boss, but I'm just being punished for it. So that's a pretty big issue with Charge Flex right now.
You would fit at home in PSU, because that is one of those games where having piercing projectiles on big bosses, you don't have to worry about weak points in that situation. It was like, imagine fighting something like what was it, like DFS or MDFA, and its entire body was a hitbox. That is what it was like playing PSU, throwing grenades into bosses and watching you hit like 14 times, or shooting a laser cannon and hitting a bunch of times like that. You would have been right at home there. But yeah, with PSO2, that's not the case.
That's actually something that base bow does do, where it has I think it's penetrating arrow is kind of like the flex equivalent. But that one kind of pierces infinitely on the targets. And it just like a lot of times you were like forsaking, like obviously you want to go for the weak points, but you're also trying to get as many pierces as possible. And you're like, you have the ability to do that, where flex arrow just, you're punished for doing it, but you want to do it.
Yeah, your pierces are finite. So
yeah,
at a certain point, there's only so much.
Yeah. And just not being able to fully hit weak points where everyone else is, you're just losing damage, all that stuff. It's just it struggles. Next, I mentioned it previously, but this also applies for, I mentioned it on Ceaseless, but it applies for every PA. Those projectiles are very slow in comparison to other ranged weapons, and they're very prone to missing. The weapon has no hit scan on it whatsoever. They don't have tracking. The only PA on Bo's kit that has tracking is uncharged flex and like your normal attacks. Everything else kind of just goes in a straight line. So even in solo, and especially in party play where you don't have aggro, you are missing a lot. So not only are you not doing damage when you land the stuff, but you're not even landing the stuff half the time. Like the new Starless Purple, I remember I think it's rank 1 with Zelvin, I forgot the name, Fortos, whatever its Starless is, and then Halvaldi. Or those, and then actually even also on rank 2, I am literally in over-the-shoulder mode for the entire purple, because I will just miss everything if I don't.
That's so wild.
Like everyone else is playing PSO2, and I'm over here playing like an FPS.
We're playing PSO2. You're playing Mass Effect. Enjoy.
Yeah.
Specifically 2 and 3. All right, not 1. 1 is different. Well, I guess 1 you can kind of count it, but still. But yeah.
So this also kind of plays back, not to kind of keep kind of throwing dirt and everything, but even like Talus and Launcher in party play, they have Talus isn't hit scan, but it's very close, and Launcher does have hit scan, and also you kind of can't really miss with Meme Beam.
With Meme Beam, you can't, but Launcher mains would like to talk to you about their PB.
Yeah,
entire section on that in the previous in the previous recording. For those of you guys who didn't get a chance to watch the Ranger interview, at the very least, go back to it, scroll to the very end, and just enjoy your laughs. You'll thank me later.
But like those weapons, like they can hit the boss. If people probably, if you remember Driverius, I don't remember what his name was. The Crimson Realm boss, the guy that everyone hated because he never died.
Yeah, Driverius.
Those 2 weapons are still hitting him. Bo, I am fairly certain I had like a 30% hit rate on that boss in party play, because his heads are flying everywhere, he's dashing everywhere, I'm getting a million things thrown at me, and I have to do it in over the shoulder mode, and it's like, I cannot hit this man.
Oh no, man! Sounds like a skill issue. Maybe something a good FPS, increased sensitivity. No, I'm sure.
I gotta get the flick. Is it?
Yeah, exactly. Start flick shotting. Oh god, I just my brain just thought about flick shotting an NGS for bow, and I at the same time I laughed and cried a little bit on the inside. I was like, oh god, please don't make them.
But yeah, that's definitely a big downside to bow. Like you obviously want to stand back and shoot when you're in long range advantage because, like I said, actually going into like the next negative as well, but bow's counter slow, it's delayed, it's weak. Under long range advantage, a lot of your PAs will start to out damage it. So you really don't want to be front and center under long range advantage, and you want to be standing back, which then leads you in the situation where your PAs are just missing. So
Yeah.
it's like a rock and a hard place. But then back to the counter. So the counter is very slow to activate, it's slow to fire, and it's also delayed. What I mean by that is by slow, I mean if you have an attack coming at you, it connects with you, and you press weapon action. You've now dodged it. You now have to press normal attack to activate the counter. And then after you do that, your character has to go into an animation to shoot the counter. 3 arrows have to form over your head afterwards, and then they fire as a projectile, not hit scan, so they can and will miss. And they have to go like the full distance away from the boss you are. So like the time between you getting hit and actually doing damage with the counter is like very long on bow. This was also like very, very prevalent in Kavaris where the enemies teleported randomly a lot. So like Pangolin, he'd swipe at you, you counter, and then by the time your counter is firing, he's like phased into the nether. He's no longer there. So you spent a lot of time, you were probably like charging a PA and you had to cancel it for the counter so you don't die. And then the counter fires and misses. You just spent like 5 seconds where you didn't actually even do any damage at all. So that the weapons counter being as slow as it is definitely a drawback. And then also, like I said, it misses a lot. Also, a more recent example, MDFA, his punch combo, the generic punch combo where he does like punch, punch, swipe, punch, punch, and then does like a big attack afterwards. Those punches, when bow counters them, your weapon action can't come out fast enough to hit the hand before they pull away. So you have to step counter. You can't counter them normally because you just won't hit them.
That sucks. That really sucks. Yeah, that's a really big strength of the different types of counters. That's one of the things that I'm glad for Soaring Blades is that though we have a conditional based block / counter, it is nice that it just does come out immediately. Any sort of follow-ups you have to do with normal attacks means that it's a bit of a pain. It's funny because Braver kind of has both, which is weird. It has its regular counter and then it has the normal attack follow-up. So it's like nice best of both worlds there, but that it's got its own issues that needs to sort out there too. So but yeah, that's man, in Counter-Star Online your counter sucks. What a crazy world
So the next kind of just extension of that, I had mentioned it previously, bow's step counter is just very funny. It's very bad, very weak. That was your only option during MDFA's punches. That's the primary reason why the MDFA solo that I managed to get was like such a big achievement in my opinion, because like his punch combo that he does is his most common move, and my only answer to that is my step counter, which is the 3rd worst step counter in the game. So I am spending a majority of the fight doing this like very, very weak move that I don't really have any other choice to do. I think it's only above Talus and Harmonizer in terms of damage that it deals. So take that as you will, but it's not a good move. And that's especially, like I had said, partners with Charge Ceaseless, where you can't even weapon action. Like once you start casting Charge Ceaseless, you can't weapon action out of it. You have to step counter if you're going to get hit. So not only are you canceling Charge Ceaseless, which is doing low damage because you have to cancel it, but you're canceling it into a very weak counter. So bow requires a lot of like boss knowledge and when you can fit stuff so that you don't have to fall to that situation. But that move does exist and it really suffers for it.
That just I feel like you're starting to get the idea here. There's a very common denominator in all of these these negatives. If you figured it out, I'll give you a hint. It rhymes with smammage. This is an issue. But yeah, go ahead.
Attack impact. So it's like, it's a nice concept, and it adds like a lot more to like bow's rotations, thinking about what you're doing. But even though it says it's adding 25% damage onto your next photon art, it's kind of not making you do as much more damage as you think it is, because you have to spend time using the normal attack beforehand. So your 25% damage PA can't exist unless you've used a normal attack. That's not like, it's a slightly different normal attack that gives you iframes, but it's still a normal attack. So you're kind of diluting the damage of the PA because you have to spend time before it using a normal attack to be able to get its bonus. So that drops a lot of the damage on the output that bow can do. Pure bow just has too much attack impact in general. There's a lot of times where you have a full gauge and you don't have an option other than to use it on a bad photon art. Like using a normal attack and then to do attack impact and then using it on like an uncharged flex is just really bad. You just spent a lot of time using a normal attack and then spending your buff that could have been used on something else on your worst PA, but you just didn't have an option to use anything else. So all you had a choice to do was stand there and not do anything and wait for it, whatever's coming at you so you can counter it, or just wasted it on the bad move.
And it's better to at least do that, I'm assuming, than to do nothing, of course.
But that wraps back around to like, a lot of times you're going to be overcapping on gauge, especially on downs where you want to be going into a down with a full gauge, but then Brave Combat Finish fills your full gauge, and then Photon Blast fills your full gauge, and you want to use them all on the down. But using whatever move, like say you have attack impact, you use it, you now have an empty gauge. If you're using charge ceaseless now, you're going to fill like half the gauge off of that, because it still refills it. So then if you're using like Brave Combat Finish after that, you're filling a gauge from like halfway instead of the full gauge from 0. So stuff like that, like bow leaks over a lot of its excess gauge, and it just, trying to figure out a way to not do that as much as possible is a lot of work, and a lot of times it just ends up not being worth it. You just have too much to be able to play around with it. But that's, outside of that, I think attack impact is fine. I think there are some things they could do to it. I'll get to that at the end. But it just, for like with most parts of the weapon, there are small things that add up on it that make it a lot worse than it really could be, or than it really should be.
No, that makes sense. And it's, again, it's one of those things where it's like, on paper, it seems like it'd be interesting. It seems like it'd be good, but like in practice, the way that it works with everything else, like you just said, you have 3 things that fill up your attack impact, and here I am still looking for one to fill opinion outside of PAs. So I'm just a little bit peeved there. It's fine. We can move past that. But like, yeah, that is definitely, when you have so many tools, you can get the situation that has happened for me, at least personally, in something like Final Fantasy 14 when I was first learning to play. Recently went back to playing that, and been playing Reaper. And the first thing when I was starting to learn to play Reaper was gauge management, and the drastic amount of, like, I want to say information overload that happens with Reaper's gauge when you first getting used to it, because there's so much of it that you can get and spend so very quickly. It makes it really, really hard to like kind of manage that in your head as you're learning the class. I can only imagine if you're like, oh, I just built ceaseless, or I just built I built up my gauge fully, and it's like, okay, I expended it, and then this built it again. I got to expend it, and this built it again, and I got to expend it. It's like, oh god, it's like trying to keep up with that can be, imagining, really overwhelming.
Yeah, my brother does the same thing with me too. He plays machinist on Final Fantasy. He's always talking to me like, this is the exact rotation I have to do at this point in the fight to not overcap my gauge, and I'm just like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, you can also tell your brother, technically you can just press every button as it lights up on machinist, and as long as you don't overcap your gauge, usually you're fine. That's unless you're going into hardcore optimization, you want to make sure that you can get the most amount of damage. That's the fun part about machinist, but he's absolutely right. If you don't do a very specific rotation in a certain part of the fight, you're just going to overcap and you're going to overflow. It happens for Machinist. It happens for Dark Knight. It's all very reminiscent of exactly what Bo is dealing with. So I'm I'm very, very familiar with that.
Okay. So moving on to dimensional array.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an awkward PA to use on the uncharged. It requires a lot of knowledge about numbers to barely squeeze any DPS out of it. The enemy has to stand in place for 4 seconds. It's a lot more achievable now than it was, but it's still like there's tons of times where like I had said against Chicken where dimensional array was like a good filler over uncharged flex. That also applies to like Bujin. But then Bujin does a dash move where he just flies across the map, and you just have a dim ray just sitting there all sad on the other side, just not hitting anything.
And there's no way to tell that he's going to do that specifically. That's the worst part.
Yeah, you have no control over it whatsoever. And if he does that, you just lost damage for no reason.
Yeah.
But the other thing with dimensional array is that it's 4 seconds duration, and over those 4 seconds, it's only just slightly over the amount of potency of a single step counter, which we already discussed is very, very weak. So
that is wild.
That kind of puts into perspective how weak uncharged flex is, where dimensional array is beating it.
That's so bad.
So on paper, though, it's kind of like a decent potency compared to other damage over times. Like jet boots, I think, whirlwind. There's another one that I'm forgetting, but I can't remember which one it was. But the difference between them is that like those other ones are like less commitment. They'll follow the player. Like whirlwind is on you at all times. You don't have to worry about it. It just happens.
Right.
I think it's fierce wave that generates like a lot of gauge for your move. That I think we had discussed that last time. Jet sweep jolt is
jolt.
Jet boots.
Jolt is basically all of jet boots. I believe it's first wave type 2 craft, I want to say. Don't be upset with me, jet boot mains out there. I'm sorry. I don't even want to think about what fierce wave does these days. But yeah, fierce wave just instantaneously builds jet sweep jolt.
Yeah. So then like those kinds of things, like they're easier to use. They stick with you. The enemy's more than likely going to get hit by most
for sure
of it. Where for uncharged dim ray, it does generate, like, I think they had buffed it at one. I don't remember when they had buffed it, but it gives like a considerable amount of attack impact gauge now. But like I had mentioned previous with attack impact, filling your gauge isn't necessarily anything important because you might end up just having to dump it on an uncharged flex. So it's not like the most important thing ever that it's giving you gauge, and half the time it's not even giving you the gauge because it's not hitting anything.
Right. Well, and my jet boot mains would be upset at me if I didn't mention this. Technically, when you do press jolt, it locks in where it's at and where it's going to go. So if something jumps past you, you just whiff jolt, which is a big deal for jet boot mains specifically because that is their whole weapon. But for the rest of us, we're like, who cares? But I can definitely see how that would be super, super frustrating, especially given that like it doesn't really stay with you. It's kind of like you lose it.
Yeah. And then also as kind of like another negative that happens as a byproduct of the recent patch, those type 1 dimensional array, people have probably seen me call it wide dim ray. I think there's a whole thing in Fleet now, wide dim ray. It like doubles the size, almost triples, I think, the size of the rain to make it more consistent. But that also sacrifices like the potential damage the other two do for more consistency. It's kind of lost that consistency bonus now because of how much faster the rain goes. So you can kind of a lot of times try to gamble on the other ones now because you're more likely to land the rain than not. Well, not really more likely to, but more likely than you used to be is what I mean to say.
You're more likely to land the consistent all the way through rain than you would be in the past.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. Yeah.
But what I wanted to get into that is wide dim ray. This is kind of a stupid thing, but Bow used to be really good for stuff like mining rig because you could wide dim ray a choke point and then go watch another choke point, and wide dim ray would grab the aggro and everything. But now wide dim ray lasts half as long, so you don't have that zone control anymore because the PA is gone almost as like a little bit after you've cast it instead of lasting the 4 years that it did before.
See, this is the irony of buffing something not always being a buff or not always being a good thing. So we buff the DPS of dim ray, or at least of it was a charge dim ray, excuse me, but like we buffed the DPS of that skill specifically, or of dim ray just in general, and didn't actually buff its use case or its damage completely. So damage buffs are not always the answers, guys. At least not always in that sort of sense. So
yeah, it's unfortunate.
for sure, for sure.
Then on to charge dimensional ray.
Mhm.
It's where you're like restocking the arrows. You're really only ever using that PA during downtime. Otherwise, you're just not touching it ever. It's not really enough of a DPS gain to ever use when a boss is active. So
Mhm.
it's a move you use at the start of the cocoon and then between bosses in a purple. And that's the only time you're pressing this button. This is actually funny because in GeoLab, I didn't do it in my video, but when you're like running between bosses, like
Mhm.
you're going from Bujin to his portal, or you're going up the stairs to Lemnis, or you're running to Monkey afterwards, you like
Mhm.
instinctively are going to be like, oh, there's downtime. Let me restock my arrows. It's a DPS loss to do that. Just the time spent slowing down to cast and then animation lock is time, and then having to like re-sprint, it's time lost than just getting to the boss like the 3 seconds faster and attacking it.
Yeah, you have to look at it from perspective of that. That is still active time that you could be
Yeah.
using on dealing damage or getting closer to dealing damage as soon as possible. So yeah, I could see that. But yeah, when you say that kind of sucks because you would think that would be the best time to do it.
Yeah,
But yeah,
like there's nothing to attack, so I want to restock my arrows, but
Mhm.
restocking the arrows is worse than just not restocking the arrows.
Exactly.
um, so then just the crafts in general for dim ray, like I had mentioned previously, all three of them. You have wide dim ray, you have the one that extends the duration of the rain, and then you have one that adds 3 more stacks onto the 5 stacks you get from charged. They're all very kind of just mediocre compared to what other like mind you, they gave so at the point in time dimensional ray was 8 seconds, like I'd said, it went up to 13 with type 2, but it
Mhm.
also nerfs the damage per hit. In a recent patch, the recent patch where they cut its speed, they also kind of slightly buffed the potency on type 2, so it's not as punishing.
That's good.
But they have basically this craft on this move where you need the enemy to stand in this thing for like 13 seconds to do like the damage of a step counter in the same patch that sword got type 2 spiral. So like
Yeah, that's a
the
tough call.
the crafts were just not good, and that applies to the new round in Ceaseless as well.
Mhm.
They had, like I had mentioned earlier, like you really need to be using them optimally to be getting anything out of them at all. So it becomes difficult to like recommend crafts to people, saying like you have people always coming up in like class channels saying like, hey, what craft should I use for this weapon? And it's like, I really don't have an answer for you unless you're willing to really learn the weapon, because you have to do so much work to get so little out of these crafts, so that you're
Gotcha.
probably just better off not using them at all. Um, but
Does hit
yeah,
one of our questions, which is pretty funny. That does come in there because that was gonna be our follow up. But did we hit everything? We still got some more we want to go into. What else do we got as far as negatives?
Encore Jump.
See, we have different opinions in Encore Jump. I will err on the side of deserved. However,
Oh,
I
believe
also
me.
sort of understand your pain
Yeah,
because
so
I'm sorry, I'll let you go
Bo,
into it. Go for it.
I mean, I'm glad Encore Jump is gone. I didn't particularly enjoy having to use it, but the issue for Bo was that Bo had to use it. Like it wasn't like negotiable for Bo. You needed to be using Encore Jump to even be scratching the damage of other people, and now that kind of is gone, and they didn't like fill that hole back up with anything.
Hmm.
So Bo just got kind of like, I said it on a tweet. Um, I am not entirely confident that Bo, like you probably count on like Wingard and probably is over.
Hmm.
I don't think Bo can solo MDFA after the removal of Encore Jump. Like it was, you have to realize that's like what 20 potency per jump, and Bo is doing like 7 jumps per charged flex that it's firing at the boss. So that's that's like 140 potency per PA you're shooting added on over a 15-minute fight. That's a lot of potency added on, and it cleared with 6 seconds remaining.
Yeah, it was a very
So
close fight. So missing that damage is going to cause like some issues there for it. So I hear you.
I think you could possibly still do it on like with a Rayar weapon as like the bare minimum if you put Glangeus Mast on it. But it's like you need a very lucky move set and very lucky crits. And in comparison, other weapons are soloing him in Melik, Hunter. This is a funny, my friend Prooms, he's a Hunter player. The day that I soloed MDFA, I had like 5 weapons. I had like a Fatale 5 Rayar, a Blaster 5 Flugel, and a Bandak 5 Flugel, and then like a Codec and an Evil Coat and floor units. I was decked out of my mind to clear with 6 seconds remaining. And he beat me by like 4 or 5 seconds on Hunter with a Prim weapon.
To be fair, this was when Hunter was broken.
Yeah, this was during Type 2 Spiral. But it's just...
which I feel like speaks more to how dumb Type 2 Spiral Edge does than how bad you were, but it is worth mentioning. And that does feel kind of bad.
So when they take away Encore Jump now, it's like to pull it off again on Glangeus Mast with Rayar would be, you need like a miracle to do it at that point. With like an Exover or a Wingguard, you're probably better off. I mean, you are better off, but you're more likely to clear with that. But just the difference between one weapon needing a Prim, others only needing a Melik, and you need this to clear, it just really shows how much Encore Jump really sways the results for Bo. I think this has been an issue for Bo for a long time, where it puts out times and they're like, oh, well, it's bad, but it's not horrible. Well, I mean, it is horrible. It's bad, but it cleared, right?
Right.
But the only reason it cleared is because it has this funny Goomba stomp.
Yeah,
that
the
it
Goomba
can't even
stomps
do
so
anymore.
much, dude. I'm so glad it's gone. I'm sorry. Bowman's out there. I feel you. I'm so sorry. I feels so mean to say it, but I am so glad it's gone. It was
like I think it's healthier, but
yeah, I was like, it's the most toxic thing for the game ever. You literally wanted to skip an add-on skill because of it. Like, and you skip skills in your skill tree because of it. It was just it was so weird, man. Like, the damage definitely needs to be somewhere else, but it does suck. You lost damage there in a situation where you already didn't have very much to begin with.
Yeah. So the next, Brave Combat. We were touching about that earlier. Brave Combat first half. So for people that don't know, Brave Combat has 2 parts. Its first half, you basically kind of just put your bow up in the air and that's it. You give yourself a buff. If you're using short cycle, it's 15-second duration buff for I think it's 45-second cooldown. Nothing happens on this first half. You just give yourself the buff. All the buff does is like increase your PP regen, I think it is. Like your active PP regen, and your PAs cost less PP during it. Where Brave Combat goes next is you use its finisher, where you lock yourself into an animation, you fire a shot, it comes down from the ceiling, hits, and does a lot of damage. People get the misconception that this finisher scales off of like the amount of hits you did while the buff was active, but that's not actually true. The only thing that you get out of it is you like regen a big chunk of HP and a big chunk of PP based on the amount of hits you did, but damage isn't affected at all. So in an optimal situation, a lot of times your game plan for Brave Combat is literally just pressing the button and holding it down. So you do the first half and then instantly do the second half because you don't care about the buff. The cooldown on the skill only happens after you cast the finisher. It doesn't start on the first cast. So you want to get the finisher out as soon as possible most of the times so you can start the cooldown earlier, if that makes sense. So like the first half of Brave Combat has almost no use whatsoever. It just kind of exists for the sake of existing, and the move kind of really suffers for it at this point. And then also Brave Combat Finisher likes to hit tons. It's like a pinion blade. It hits some ones everywhere. Everywhere you can think that it can hit a one, it manages to hit a one.
That hitbox is just absolutely ridiculous. And to give context to the whole Brave Combat situation, Brave Combat's very reminiscent of a skill that existed back in base PSO2 as well, and that skill did scale with number of hits. It only worked for Katana specifically, if I remember correctly. And I
Yeah.
don't. It wasn't like I can't remember what it was called specifically. I don't think it was called Brave Combat. It was called something else.
Yeah.
But the way it worked was you activated it, and then the number of hits that you got, actually, it wasn't even like how much damage you dealt, but the number of hits you got during the time frame that the buff was up scaled the amount of damage that your finisher would do, which is why Katana, when I said beforehand that it had like 4 PAs realistically that would use, one of them was the PA that you spam that gave you the most number of hits that did a decent amount of damage. That basically kind of looked like Lotus, except you charged it a bit. It was very similar in a sense that it was the whole idea for it was to get as many hits as possible, and then you would just press the finisher and get all the damage. That's the reason, and most people don't realize that it doesn't actually work that way, myself included. I didn't realize that until I had these interviews. I just assumed they took it one for one from previous, and yeah, it doesn't scale at all, which quite frankly is stupid. Like, no offense to anyone out there who designed it. I understand you want to make it ease of use in that sort of situation, but that is really dumb.
Yeah. So like the way it is now, your first half, like I'll always say, and people probably will call me out at this point for saying like, oh my God, you're so doom and gloom about Braver. But I really do think that Brave Combat is like one of, I don't want to say the weakest, but it's definitely up there on the weakest active skills in the game, just because of like, it's such a commitment to use. You iframe through the entire thing, and it's such a long animation that you're throwing away counters to use it a lot of times. If you're not precasting on like a down, like the boss goes down and you don't already have the first half of Brave Combat ticking its timer, you then have to, like, while the boss is down, use the first half and then the second half. The second half does very low damage compared to a lot of other active skills, and again, it doesn't scale off of your combo count, so you can't improve that in any way. It just doesn't do the damage. It also is not considered a PA, so it doesn't scale off of long range advantage, stuff like that. Like, it's just not a great move for the class. It has so many kind of drawbacks and kind of like just clunk to it without really doing enough for you. Like, the way it is now, it could be doing more for you. Like, it gives you PP and HP, but it just doesn't do the damage to warrant holding on to it like that. Like, it's just it needs help, and I'll get into some things that I think could help with that. But just right now, Brave Combat is a struggling move in comparison to a lot of other active skills.
And it's worth mentioning, or worth at least the question here in this situation, because I know fighters on their end, they've got overdrive or limit break depending upon what server you're playing on. Is it over? I forget if it's over. I don't know, dude. I always call it limit break. But fighter has limit break on their end, where their cooldown, I mean, when they press it, of course, they're doing more damage for that period of time, and the cooldown is affected as well. With Brave Combat, like, seeing as it's just press button, then mostly usually hold button to just do damage, like, how does that feel? Like, how does that factor in with the short cooldown? Like, is it always a damage bonus to have it versus not? Because like
there's there's a lot of
like,
times where you really don't even want to press Brave Combat. Like, if there's a lot of counters coming at you, or a window where you know you're going to be able to do a decent chunk of damage, Brave Combat doesn't do enough damage to warrant using it at those points. So you kind of just let the skill sit there, and you just won't use it until you get to a point where you're not, like, back in MDFA, when I was encore jumping, I'm like encoring on his hand and shooting flex into him while his hands are resting on the stage. I don't want to use Brave Combat during that because it doesn't do more damage than encore flexing. So all I could do was kind of like wait to use Brave Combat as a precast instead, because that's a window where I'm not doing damage.
So would
like
that make would that make Brave Combat better to like leave without a short cooldown then? Because like I feel like it would depend on the fight at that point.
It can kind of depend. For the most part, like, when you're really trying to squeeze in optimal stuff, you can usually find spots for it where it's useful, but it takes a lot of stretches to do that. I know, I can't remember for the life of me the boss it was on. It might have been Kilkundo in Retem Purple, where we were theory crafting having like Brave Combat for a certain move that it does, where I'm throwing away a single counter for it, but I'll get a Brave Combat off. And having the lower cooldown helps for having it ready for those points. It's the same thing as like how your Photon Blast, you don't use it immediately of getting it, but you still want to get it fast enough that you have it ready for the times you need it.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. I was thinking about. I was like, wait, if there are moments where it would just sit and it doesn't actually give you any damage while it's up, like, does the cooldown even matter at that point? Like,
Yeah.
you're just trying to fit it in and stuff like that. So yeah, no, it was just something I was curious about in the mix there. But yeah, I agree. Brave Combat is
struggling.
bad. I'll just say it. They don't have to hate you for it. They can hate me for it. It's bad. That sounds awful. A skill where you use it and then immediately use its finisher, you don't care about taking advantage of its bonuses, is pretty terrible in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that is not great.
So I only have a few more. I know I'm talking your ear off, but I have a few more.
Go for it.
Only a handful. Well, this is probably one that I've hinted out throughout the entire thing. Long range advantage is the worst thing that they've ever added to the game, ever.
I think that's an overstatement, but I understand as a range player because I feel like you're not the only person that has this sort of mindset. But go on.
Despise it. For Bo, it completely alters Bo's play style to be infinitely more uninteresting, where you have a weapon that's like utilizing all his PAs for the most part in a fight. When you're using long range advantage, you're standing in the back, pressing charge ceaseless off cooldown. And charge ceaseless is a 5-second animation lock. So you're literally just standing there, charge, shoot, watch cutscene, charge, shoot, watch cutscene, charge, shoot, watch cutscene. And it really just ruins the play style of Bo.
Yeah, it sounds great to me. Sharpshooter. No, yeah, I can totally understand that. Yeah, that sounds pretty bad.
The 15% buff really just for Bo needed to be on everything that it does without the conditional nature.
Mm-hmm.
And that would still leave Bo at like below average, even if it did do that. And the reason that this is an issue is that this skill might impact future buffs and make them more difficult to make. Now, kind of like devs will have to look at stuff and be like, oh, we want to give Bo like a 15% damage increase and everything. Wait, but long range advantage still exists. Let's give him a 5%. Stuff like that, I think, is a potential problem of this existing. That being said, long range advantage as it is, if it were something that is unavoidable and needs to be in the game no matter what, it's still not even enough for what Bo needs. Bo doesn't ever even have to take ranger sub in stuff. I mean, obviously you want it on like Dalian just because of how that fight works, but
yeah,
outside of that, in like purples and stuff, or like Lucille with like a good team, you don't take ranger sub anyway because you don't need stealth strike. You're not going to take aggro anyway, even with the 15%.
With a decent team, I'm sure there's someone out there that's like, I take aggro with Bo. I'm like, yeah, people are bad. Go ahead.
Assuming everyone's like the same skill level as you, you're just not going to be taking aggro with it.
Exactly.
The only time Bo is going to see aggro in like party play like that is like if you have a trigger finger on shooting your supercharged flex precast when like a boss spawns in a purple. Like he spawns, I always get yelled at by a friend of mine for like boss spawns and I've like fire off that supercharged flex before it's even finished hitting the ground, and then I have aggro and the boss starts spazzing out because it's chasing the ranged player. Stuff like that. But outside of that, like even with long range advantage, you're not going to be seeing aggro with a skilled team. You just don't do enough damage despite 15%. With ceaseless, charge ceaseless is actually a very powerful, and I say powerful actually in comparison to things like the upper classes, like the better classes, when you have both long range advantage and attack impact activated, because that's a 40% buff on this move. At that point, it's 15% from long range advantage, 25% from attack impact. So during that singular like one PA where those things line up, you're actually doing decent damage. But that still needs like attack impact to come around every once in a while, and you also have to be under long range advantage. So it's just not enough for what the weapon needs.
Yeah, for sure.
Like the rest of its kit. And I think that long range advantage really skews how people view it because they're like, oh wow, my ceaseless is doing so much damage here. And it's like, well, take away the funny 15% buff. That's very poorly implemented. And
Yeah, and that's something I was gonna say too. Like when it comes to long range advantage, and this is more like in favor of versus against. It should be across the board. It
yeah,
really should just be for everything across the board, regardless, and then you can actually properly tune classes. Because making it so specific the way they have, I actually want
yeah,
to kind of err on the side of caution. But making it so specific just actively makes it more difficult to balance the other classes. You've
yeah.
basically introduced another layer of variability that just doesn't need to exist, in my opinion.
Mhm. So next up, PP issues in co-op. Bo doesn't actually have PP issues in solo. I don't think too many classes do, just because the boss is like on top of you. And it
Hmm.
honestly does actually kind of suffer in solo if the boss is like big and slow enough, because Bo has large PP costs.
Hmm.
Um, but in co-op, where you're not countering anything, that becomes a lot more like apparent. You run out of PP a lot, so your damage kind of will start to tank. And then you also have to start actually holding on to the Brave Combat buff to like have reduced PP costs and all that, which
Hmm.
then is pushing back your cooldown because you're holding on to the buff instead of instantly casting, so you're doing less damage. And it's just a lot of that stuff kind of fights with each other, and you
Hmm.
don't really have a way to do it. So you have to kind of break up your casting of Ceaseless to go counter something to do less damage so that you can have the PP to keep using Ceaseless.
Hmm. Yeah, that is definitely an issue. And to kind of build up on the whole mindset of less damage from Brave Combat, or in case anyone kind of missed that,
Yeah.
essentially it's just not pressing Brave Combat again immediately doesn't start its cooldown faster, meaning that you could effectively end up getting one less Brave Combat, or maybe
Yeah.
even two, depending on how long the fight is,
Mhm.
across the entire fight. So that is something to keep in mind for these uses if you have to hold on to it. Because yeah, you would think that, oh yeah, Brave Combat kind of fixes your problem. Oh, PP usage. That way, you can just hold on to it, and then God forbid you forget to press it again.
Yeah.
You just don't get any damage at all, which it feels awful. On top of that, you then now you took longer to get the cooldown back up. So yeah.
um so then the last kind of couple handful, ranged uptime is a lie. There's no such thing as ranged uptime in this game. You can't convince me of that. Bosses are on top of you. um you're missing like crazy stuff where like Falls bosses, like Dark Falls, I think it's Arati, you just call him regular Dark Falls.
Hmm.
People are always like, oh, his arms are swinging everywhere, I can't hit him with melee, but range definitely has uptime. And I'm over there sitting there watching my flex arrows like fly off into space, and I'm like, I it's not really the case.
To be fair,
uh
range does have
it,
uptime. It's
it
just
does,
not
but
bow. Like it's not the exact same. So, and I've always even said this. I think actually you might have seen me mention this on Twitter as well, because people have this mindset of like, oh well, if you're range, you're far back away, and it's if I'm assuming
yeah,
you've also played Final Fantasy 14. You mentioned it earlier.
yeah,
Yeah, so like the mindset in 14 or in other games like that sort is that like if you're range, you're in a safer perspective. Either you can move more often, or you're not right up in the bosses, like right in their butt or right in their face, having to deal with a lot of those melee problems.
uh-huh.
In PSO2, that's not the thing. Either bosses attack the entire field at once, so you're not safe being further away, just not as the thing, or there are some bosses that literally just I am convinced. I have not seen exact proof of this. I have only my specific like proof of it, or I guess anything like that, is mostly circumstantial of what I've dealt with, but I'm convinced that bosses have um a ranged enmity like multiplier that occasionally they'll just drop and then see who the furthest person is from them and then just run for that person. And
Yeah,
it happens all the time. So when
yeah.
I say, and people have probably seen this on Twitter, when I say ranged isn't just safe, I'm saying that no one is safe when it comes to bossing. Bosses are all over the place.
You can really see that in actually the current limited time quest at this point, where it's like
Hmm.
Croc and then Ams, he'll be sitting there fighting the melees, and then he's just peacing out. He's going to the other side of the map to go beat up the ranged guy.
Yeah, I'm crushing 15k damage on AMS in like the middle of a fight or whatever, and then he'll just turn and go fight someone else. I'm like, I'm in a pug. I'm not gonna
Yeah.
say that I'm better than everyone here, but there's no way that someone
Yeah.
that did more damage way off in BFE or something like that, right? So
So like, yeah, ranged, it's not an advantage for the most part. A lot of times where range does have a an uptime advantage over melee, you could equally go around and say melee has an uptime advantage over range on other stuff.
mhm.
AIM's also being a pretty easy example of that. Range has to go run the size of a football field to go around the shield, while melee has to like make a baby step in a direction and they're around it.
Yep. The orb.
And then also like with the charging nature of Bo's PAs, where again there's human error, the charge time and all that, you're just the uptime really isn't there for being a ranged weapon. And we had mentioned this before, like all the missing and stuff. Next, Bo's like biggest contribution to Braver outside of its down windows are its precasts, and precasts aren't always available on every quest. Geolab rank 2, you have to run to Ikasabujin to spawn him, so you can't use your precasts. Again, between the fights itself, you can't use your precast because you're running to them. So it's not like one of your biggest strengths, and again, it's not very strong compared to others as well, but one of your biggest relative strengths you can't even use a lot of times just because of the way stuff is structured. And also just for so people know this, supercharged flex, the third stage of flex arrow, you sit there and you charge it. It's like a long charge to get to the final stage. Once you like prime that PA and it's like you're at the stage, you're ready to fire it, you can no longer move. Bow stops being able to move once it's at that point. It locks down in place and all you can do is aim. So like if you want to try to precast while also spawning a boss that requires you to walk somewhere to do that, you have to like know the exact point that you're going to finish charging the PA so that you lock down where the boss spawns. So you have to like memorize floor tiles and stuff to know like where do I need to end so that this boss spawns and I can shoot him with this PA. And a lot of times that's not even worth the time spent doing that when you could have just run and spawned the boss earlier. But
for the record, that is what Soaring Blades does for gap closing in on Iskabujin. But the difference between what I would do versus what you would do is you're charging and then having to walk and kind of perfectly time the boss spawning versus not. Because I imagine if you spawn him too early, you're just going to get sliced. The whole thing is wasted. But if you don't get up to him and you don't spawn him, then you wasted that time. For me, it's literally just as soon as I hit that spot on the floor, I know is a good spot. I just press my gap close and I'm done. So it's definitely a different perspective for sure.
So the last two negatives that I have, enemy hitboxes hurt Bo's damage a lot. So there are two examples of this. Stuff like the most easiest example, I think, Didal weapons. He raises his arm up to do a swing, and his weapon is now covering his chest. His weapon takes significantly reduced damage compared to his body. Your flex arrow is going right through his weapon because you're ranged. You can't position yourself better. So you're just having your damage for no reason whatsoever, just because of the way the boss decides to face when it's using its moves. And then this is one I swear to you, I'm not going insane, but I know this is a thing. I just can't figure out what causes it. Enemies, I call it enemies breathe, man.
Out for debate, by the way, whether or not you're insane, but go ahead and go on. The jury will figure it out.
I'm a little insane, I'll admit it, but
it's fine.
Enemies just randomly will take more or less hits from flex, like a Pedis you're shooting at. Sometimes you shoot him with flex and you pierce 2 times. Sometimes you shoot him with flex and you pierce him 3 times. And where piercing 3 times on flex is the cutoff on it being like the worthwhile move to use, to suddenly just randomly pierce 2 times for no reason whatsoever, it's just a DPS loss for something you genuinely have no control over. And the reason I know that this is a thing is because Solus pods in phase 1, where his pods are rotating around the map, just randomly you shoot him with a flex arrow. Sometimes they take 3 pierces, sometimes they take 2, and they are completely stationary objects just sitting on the ground, and you just randomly lose a tick of your pierce on them for nothing. So you have no way to know when it's going to happen, and it just happens, and you just lose damage. Because
all of you to assume that Solus pods are all shaped the same.
That's why I say they're breathing, they're growing, they're expanding, and then they're shrinking back down. And I'm just kidding.
Okay. The jury's with you this time, but we'll see.
So someone go play that. I probably am insane at just imagining things, but someone go test that and tell me if I'm insane, because I don't want to play it ever again.
I'm sure as much as Reddit detectives things, there's got to be someone out there that'll be like, all right, so I took the footage and I slowed it down. And if you look at it frame by frame, it's pulsing in and out. And that pulse is just enough to get that 3. But when it goes back in, it's like, oh, okay. So
Yeah, that drives me insane. I know it's a thing, but I also am waiting for someone to tell me, no, you're just crazy. And then the final negative I mentioned a couple times, Bo very frequently uses over the shoulder mode, even in party play. This is very disorienting for your average player. I can understand it's very off-putting for a lot of people, but it is like kind of like, I don't want to say a requirement. Obviously, you play the weapon how you want, but if you want to get the most out of the weapon, you need to know how to use over the shoulder mode like pretty extensively to be able to like swap in and out. Like there are a lot of times as well, like what am I thinking of? Like Dalian, when his puppets leave the stage so he can do like the 2 big orange swipes during like the 4 times puppet. They start like doing that little spin around before they then dip under the stage to let him start doing that. You want to go into like over the shoulder mode very briefly on Bo to charge a flex and then just fling a shot, just a Hail Mary to catch them on the way out. Stuff like that. It's like, it's a very involved usage of over the shoulder that you kind of have to know how to use for using the weapon optimally. So that you could count that as a positive. I personally would count it as a positive because I actually enjoy over the shoulder mode for stuff like that. I don't like sitting in it for the entire fight like long range advantage makes you do, but for small usages like that, it's fun. But it does, like, to optimize, you do need it.
Gotcha. So the good
And
news
that's it.
The good news about the negative section is it wasn't 2 hours. But we're getting close to the 2-hour mark anyway, so that's okay. Now, we did get through a lot of negatives, and I do want to kind of, we kind of preface this, and I want to kind of add this at the very end of this. It's a very common thing that happens. It's something that was brought up when we did the Ranger interview. It was something that's brought up when we did the Force interview. It's something that will be brought up again when we talk about weapons that do have struggles and moments they don't do the best. This does not mean that you are bad for playing a weapon. This does not mean that we are condemning you for choosing to play this weapon. There seems to be this sort of concept, and I know it sucks hearing your weapon is bad. Trust me, I promise you, sometimes it sucks hearing your weapon is good and knowing you hate playing it. But that's besides the point. I know hearing your weapon sucks. Like, it's not fun. It's irritating. It can be annoying and things of that sort. However, no one wants you to have to deal with a bad weapon.
Yeah.
Some people have this mindset of like, oh, this weapon is just for this and that's all it's for. And in fact, you want to do something else, you're stupid for it. I don't agree with those people. They can have that mindset if they want to, but all of these things are said in the mind that there's an enthusiast behind this weapon and they want it to be as good as it can be for you while also having all of those things. So if you heard something's bad and you're like, I like doing that. Oh, I feel bad that it's no, don't feel bad. It's fine that it's cool. Like if you did a whole lot of like, if you're thinking to yourself like, hey, dude, he's talking about this being bad. Well, I did this and I was able to do that. And I get thrown all the time. And that's you. That is not the weapon. Do not give that win away to your weapon. That is the player's skill. And this is something I see happen all the time in fighting games where people talk about tiers when it comes to characters. And to me, it does not make any sense. When they're like, oh, you talk about this character being low tier, but like I never lose. I'm like, yeah, dude, that is you. Like the same effort in any other character and you're killing it. Why would you give that to the character and not yourself? That never understood that. So if you had that mindset and listening to all of this, please do not fret. We are with you. Definitely want the best moving forward itself. It doesn't mean that you're bad. And I'll go ahead and let you add on to that if you like to as well.
Yeah. So just 2 things that I kind of want to add on to that. I'm a really big supporter of play what you want to play. And that kind of leans into the other thing that I wanted to say. When I compare stuff to other classes, like I know I've brought up, I definitely brought up Force. I brought up like Launcher. I brought up Hunter. I want to dispel this right now, and I know I did previously. I, under no circumstances, want other classes to suffer for my class. I fully support if like people want their weapons to be better. I completely understand that. I use it as kind of like factual comparisons just to kind of point out where Bo actually is, because I think there's a lot of community perceptions that it's better than it is. That Braver, I have a community perception section on this outline I'm reading from that I'll get into in a few minutes. But like I I know Mitch has like a knife pointed at my back right now, pointing to talking about Force, but like seriously, I want Force to be buffed. I think Force needs help. I think there's stuff on Hunter that needs help. I think Launcher, like people that want a solo Launcher, I support that, all that kind of stuff. I'm just showing off how Bow compares to them, just to really paint the picture of like this weapon has been really struggling. And really the only way to do that, to kind of like get it through to people, to help them understand, is to point to other classes that are struggling. So it's not like a competition that I'm trying to say like, oh, Bow is so much worse than blank, so Bow needs it more than whatever. It's just, no, I'm just doing it so that you understand where it is. I want them all to be fixed.
Right.
I'm a big supporter of like the entire game's balance. Obviously, I'm talking the most about Bow because it's the weapon that I play and it's in such a bad spot, but I really do want like everyone to be having fun playing the game at the end of the day. So
Right.
I hope that going through this and hearing some of the comparisons that I've made, that people, and I will make some more comparisons in the community perceptions part, but I really hope people don't take that way. Like, I hope people understand that I'm trying to get people into a healthier mindset on understanding just where stuff lands in terms of balance compared to each other, so that they can really understand where stuff actually lies.
Right. And even in this entire interview, when we've had like, there have been moments where I'm like, I don't exactly agree, but you know, you can have disagreements. People can disagree with how Bow plays. Like, I know for some people, like just looking through things like X, through looking through Discords and stuff like that, there are people that absolutely loved base PSO2 Bow. And as someone who's done research into the weapons themselves, NGS is not base PSO2 Bow. I would argue that I like NGS Bow more than I like base PSO2 Bow's design, because I feel like it was too one-dimensional in its design. However, it's a situation where what you like may not always align with what someone else likes. The biggest thing here that we're trying to drive home, or that at least I personally feel like it needs to happen, because I know there's some people that are like, oh, well, if everything does the same damage, then it's just boring. You're absolutely right. In my opinion, unbalance is the spice of MMOs. When something is stronger than something else, it's like, oh, cool, that's that. You know, it breeds conversation, right? Like, you're like, oh, dude, Slayers are killing it right now, or like, oh, Hunter right now is busted because of some weird thing that's going on. Like, it's fun, right? Like, it's a cool conversation to have. But when something is so far off the mark, like laughably far, for so incredibly long, like that's when it becomes taxing. It becomes laborious, and it's not fun. If everything was within like 5% of each other, and like Slayer was at the top end and Bow was like 5% weaker, I don't think anyone would be complaining. Like, if it'd be a conversation of like how the weapons play, sure, like that would be a conversation point, absolutely. But the point of the matter is that it's way further than that. Like, it is a vast difference as far as that process goes. And that's something to keep in mind when we're looking here, because you may think, oh, there's no problem, but like, it doesn't feel good. Like, and I know we talked a lot about solos, but like, that's also an aspect of the game. They're two sides of it. There's party play and there's solo play, and you may have a different opinion on whether something should be soloable or not, but like, it's obvious it's there. I mean, quite literally, we have ARCs records. We have mechanics in the game for it. We have rewards for solos and things of that sort. So it's definitely part of the process, and it's something that I feel like all of it really needs to be addressed. So I do want to kind of put that out there, because I know people have that sort of mindset, and I understand like it might seem unfair to one individual versus another, but like, it's about getting things closer together while also feeling fun to play. And you may not agree that it's fun to play. That's a whole different conversation, to be perfectly honest. That is a whole nother video, honestly, that could exist, and that has existed for me, at least when it comes to balance. And I'm sure you could have one as well when it comes to Bow. But that's just something to keep in mind. But you mentioned community perception. That should be fun, because that's one that I have seen a lot of, and I would like to, at the very least, touch on it. So what are our computer perception notes that we have here?
So I actually had 3, but we kind of already hit one previously, which was ranged weapons should be ranged, and we kind of know that doesn't work in the game.
Yeah, it's not a thing.
It's not a thing. Just as a few extra examples of that to kind of really hammer that home. You have something like People recognize those like dragon bosses in, I think they're in Alio, Stia, and I feel like there's another one I can't remember. It's like LD Scythe or whatever. This boss has like a gap close where he'll take a step back and then charge at you, and it's like, oh, funny gap close move to get him onto the ranged players. I understand. And then you turn around and run from him to cover distance, and he doesn't use the gap close. He just does his basic run, and it's like the same speed as your photon dash. Like, you cannot get away from this man. He is faster than the speed of sound, just keeping up with you, and you can't create range on these enemies. And this is apparent for like a lot of enemies in the game where they just are so fast. How are you ever supposed to play range against them? Because they're not going to let you. A couple other examples. I just remember talking to a couple fighters in my alliance. I asked them, when you're this was back around when version 2 launched, when Venogia was kind of like the hot new thing for people to be soloing. I was asking the fighters, how many times does this boss do his dive kick on you, where he jumps up into the air and dives back down? And they said like 4 or 5. And this is like an 7 to like 9 minute fight for people. He dive kicks like 4 or 5 times over the entire thing. And I'm over there like, I'm practically in melee range on this boss, but I'm a ranged weapon. He must have something in his code that recognizes that I'm either ranged or I'm very slightly out of melee range of him. He dive kicks like 18 to 19 times for me in every run, because he is not going to let you get away. You're not going to not be in melee range on this boss. He's not going to let you. And then the final one, which I think is the most obvious because it's the most recent, Dalian straight up forces you to fight in melee range.
You cannot be ranged. You can't be away from him, or you will be punished.
You go stand in melee on that boss, or you die.
Well, you stand in melee, or your friends die. That's the worst part. Is like you get them hit.
Yeah. There are some benefits there to being ranged. Like, if you stand on the very outer circle, like within the circle still, it'll prevent, like during the 4 corners, it won't do like those moves where they turn orange and do the big cone in front of them. That's actually distance based. So if you're at the max range, they won't do that. But that's about it. And you're still like, this boss is still constantly attacking you, like on top of you technically, because you're within a certain range of him that you can't leave. You're not ranged. You're pseudo ranged and get a benefit for not being on top of him. And that's the extent of it.
That's hilarious.
Ranged weapons, like no matter what you do, it's not really going to work well in this game. You see this in stuff like Launcher too. Launcher doesn't have ways to handle enemies on top of it, and that's why you don't really see Launcher doing solos, because it can't handle that. The game isn't designed to let you play from range when you're soloing. Ranged weapons, the only time ranged weapons can be ranged, which is like where Launcher really shines, is when it's under long range advantage in party play, because you don't have the enemy on top of you for the most part. But even then, like, you're not going to be using Launcher in like Aegis, because he's still hitting you anyway. It's just not something that prove me wrong. I open up the discussion for that, but for anyone that wants to, but I don't think it's something that will ever make sense in the game as it is now. I don't think it's a class design problem. I think it's always been an enemy design problem that prevents range from being a thing.
And that's what I was going to say is, I think the only way to fix this problem, and they kind of started doing it, but I feel like it's kind of a back and forth sort of thing. It depends on the target you're dealing with. Some enemies do change their patterns when you're far enough away, but those patterns are not always to stay far away. A lot of times it's you're far enough away, I'm gonna jump, nothing personnel, kid your ass. That's how they're gonna respond to that situation. I feel like it does exist, it's there, like the possibility for that process is there. It just needs to be iterated on a bit more. And then you have the larger boss fights where it's just what range. Like we're swiping the entire field, what range do you have? It doesn't exist. That's hilarious. I think you can get away from us.
And also for like falls fights as well, something in base was, hey, ranged had an advantage, we could shoot the boss while he was off the stage. But every falls is now invulnerable when they're off the stage. Like, you can't shoot Aegis when he's not there, so there's not really even any benefit there. You have to wait for the boss to be on the stage and in melee range for you to be dealing damage to it. Any
That was a
any
thing.
kind of like uptime you have, like in Aegis, the single bit of uptime ranged has is when he does like the trains, because he spawns them so far away you can get like 1 or 2 shots in before everyone else can go back to hitting it. And that's it.
Mhm.
That's the extent of your uptime bonus for being ranged. It's just, it doesn't exist in this game as it is right now, and I don't think it will for a long time unless they start really overhauling enemy
For sure.
AI and mechanics.
Yeah, gotta agree.
The next one we've touched on a little bit, base bow and Banish Arrow.
Oh
Um,
boy.
so again, people have probably heard me constantly trashing Banish Arrow. It's not something I enjoy personally, but I do think there's a solid case for why it won't work in NGS bow. I think a lot of people kind of, and the reason I bring this up is a lot of people really like to sideline discussions about NGS bow, like constructive criticism, ways to improve it so that like feedback can be submitted and stuff. They'll just kind of sideline it and say, add Banish back. Base bow is better. And I don't think that's very helpful. Um, the reason I believe it doesn't work is Banish Arrow. For people that didn't know, Banish Arrow was like you shot a bomb that stuck to the enemy, and then it just sat there. And then the next time you dealt damage to whoever had the bomb on them, started like a 3-second countdown, and then all of the damage you dealt during that countdown was like compounded into the final explosion.
Yeah, it was
So
range Volgraptor.
yeah. So the reason that I don't think that this will work on NGS bow is base bows, like I had mentioned, its charge, like PAs didn't change anything about them other than like making them faster. Like penetrating arrow, charging it didn't do anything other than just make it do more damage. Master shot,
Mhm.
charging it didn't do anything other than make it do more damage. Maybe it shot a few extra shots or something like that. But so when you went to Banish, and especially on penetrating arrow, where the uncharged version of penetrating arrow also pierced like as much as the charged,
Mhm.
like you slap Banish onto an enemy, and then you're just kind of like hitting all of your uncharged, whichever works the best. Obviously, you're putting in some combos there, like you're using Final Nemesis, you're using I think it was like Torrential Arrow, setting up combos. But for the most part, you're not losing parts of your kit to use the uncharged version of this PA to like contribute as fast as possible to Banish. Like you're mashing uncharged penetrating arrow like 7-8 times during that window to get as many ticks as possible as fast as possible. If you translate that to NGS bow, where now you want to get as many hits as possible as fast as possible during the window, you're stuck using uncharged moves, but then you're cutting out the entire rest of your kit because charging your PAs on NGS bow are entirely different moves.
Mhm.
So I think just adding stuff like that to NGS bow would really kind of ruin how it would go against how NGS bow is currently designed. Like I don't think there's a situation where they can really exist alongside of each other, just because one really wants you to be like fully an uncharged weapon with a few exceptions, and the other one is like you want to use your entire uncharged and charged kit. I think Banish was notorious. It kind of killed like a lot of base bows PAs. You didn't want to use a good chunk of them because they just didn't
Mhm.
perform well with Banish. And a very large portion of your kit was, does this work with Banish?
That
And
was
I
the
don't
entire
think,
kit.
yeah. And you don't want that to be the same case for NGS bow, because NGS bow has such like a kind of full kit that the second you add something like that, you're just kind of removing the entire kit that already exists.
Yeah, like that was one thing I did kind of. I want to say I bashed an NGS bow or not NGS, but base bow because of this. But like base bow was Banish Arrow bow. Like it was the entire kit for the most part. I'm not gonna say completely. There were some specific caveats, but for the most part, if you were playing bow, it was how can I optimize or maximize Banish Arrow,
Yeah.
and everything revolved specifically around that, and that was the mechanic of the weapon. It was very one dimensional in that sense. You could argue that there was like some decision making that would happen between crafts and things of that sort, but when you had it all solved, it was what is my max damage I can get into Banish Arrow,
Yeah.
and then what the subclass was that let me do that and maintain PP in the best sort of way,
Yeah.
which I believe was Atoll or Phantom at the time. But if you were to take that and just shove it into NGS bow, like you have two conflicting kits.
Mhm.
Like they don't come together, they don't mesh together. I think what some people want is just to overwrite the kit that Bo has with Banish Arrow, which I think would be like, it probably would work, but it would be lame.
Yeah.
Like it would, you're just bringing back base Bo, which some people might be happy about, but like I think it would be lame. I think it would be a loss that of what we have currently, because what you have currently isn't broken per se. It just needs tweaking.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's like people are free to like whichever one they like more. Obviously, I prefer NGS bow. If you like base bow, that's completely fine. I just think that if you like base bow, it's not like it's gone anywhere. It's still there for you to go play with. You have all the enemies in the world to go banish whatever. I don't think that it's worth destroying like a well, for the most part, designed weapon that already exists in a different game for concepts that existed in a completely different game, if that makes
yeah,
sense. Like, and the reason that I bring this up is, as I had said at the start, I think it tends to sideline a lot of constructive discussion about bow. And I
mm-hmm.
just, it's not something that I personally see ever really being a thing. I think on top of like the numerous things, like issues that Banish brought. I remember that whole like Gunner fiasco where Banish was deleting worlds because of how much damage it was dealing when combined with whatever Gunner was doing.
Chain trigger plus Banish Arrow plus, oh god, there's a
Yeah,
reason damage caps existed in the game, and it's mostly
yeah.
their fault.
Like I imagine they don't want to like revisit that. So
It's so bad. We kind of have that in NGS a little bit right now that they haven't really gone into with chain trigger and any stomp mechanic ability that
yeah.
is in the game at the moment, which is just really weird. But yeah, it to say it
Hellion.
was broken, it would be putting it lightly.
Yeah, I remember like Hellions hitting his like 1 millions in Lucille with chain trigger of the step counter bombs or whatever. And it's like, all right, well,
Yep.
that and obviously like you probably can't do that in NGS because obviously you're not getting chain trigger on bow if you ever do that combination. But it's just I doubt that they want to revisit the potential of that happening again.
Exactly.
So yeah, and now the final one, the one everyone's been waiting for: people versus Braver, and specifically Katana, and how much people just really love to hate Katana, and the three golden words, just play Katana, when someone's saying something about bow, or bow is horrible, but if you buff it, it's like you're buffing Katana, which really isn't the case. That's buffing Braver.
Yeah,
It's not
that's so bad.
stuff like that. I don't think is really healthy a healthy way to view things. And just to kind of like shed some light on that situation, back in Kavaris, prior to Kavaris, Katana was very weak. Actually, I think it was like prior to Retem. It started getting fixed a little in Retem and then got its big buffs in Kavaris.
Mhm.
At that time, Katana was the individual strongest weapon in the game throughout Kavaris. But Braver wasn't the best class in the game. Fighter was. Katana individually was stronger than any individual fighter weapon, but when combined, Fighter got two very strong weapons and Double Saber, which at that time was very weak, and Katana was like, uh, what's the meme? It's like hydrogen bomb versus coughing baby.
Yeah.
That's that's what Braver was. So
Hmm.
it's like, I don't think, despite Katana being as strong as it was, I don't think Braver actually won anything during that period. Like, it didn't win purple. I'm pretty sure Bouncer beat it during Dark Falls rank 2.
Hmm.
And then I think Fighter kept beating it during Ark's records. And until Waker came out, it wasn't like amazing at first, but then it started getting stuff. And then once that started going, Katana never stood a chance against it.
Hmm.
But the main reason I bring that up is people are always like, oh, well, at that point in time, we know that bow is horrible, but you can't buff it because Katana is so strong. But then on the same side, we're like, Double Saber is really bad. We need this to get buffed. And then you go into Stia, Double Saber gets buffed to be the best weapon in the game for that initial patch. while its other two weapons are still very potent. And then you look at Braver and still Katana is there. Katana is getting beaten out by like by pure double saber at this point, and then like full fighter is also beating it. And Bo is still just sitting there at the bottom of the dumpster, and people are still like, you can't buff this weapon because Katana is so strong. And it's just, I think there's a lot of double standards. And again, like I had mentioned earlier, I understand double saber was very weak at that point. Bo was weaker, as it tends to be. I'm not saying double saber didn't need buffs at that point in time. I'm just saying that there's a double standard where people are like, yeah, it's okay for that to get buffed, even though its class is number 1. Bo can't get buffed because Katana is so strong. Stuff like that. It's just, I don't know how to go about getting people to understand that there are double standards there that are very unfortunate.
And the thing is like the double standard's incorrect. Like it's not right. Katana. Okay, so crazy concept. I know some of you guys who follow the channel may not believe this. And some people even in the comments of the Katana video were like, we still don't believe you. Katana is not broken. I have never said it's broken. I have said it gives the like illusion that the weapon is busted because it just has an answer to everything. However, the having an answer to everything does not make you the most damaging weapon in the game. In a lot of cases, it actually works against you in some situations where you're so incredibly safe, you lose damage. So while it is what I would consider almost the gold standard of melee weapons when it comes to individual mechanics, it is not perfect. They're much like you mentioned, Brave Combat is a problem. It's the same thing on Katana. It works exactly the same way. So it's just as stupid over there. And as powerful as having the ability to counter something, step counter something, normal attack, follow up something, and be invulnerable and safe, that can potentially be a lot of lost damage. And that is an issue itself that Katana does have to deal with. So it's almost insane for people. It's like the same adage that exists in Final Fantasy XIV with Dragoons just being floor tanks. That has not been the case for like 6 years. It has been different for a while. I mean, 6 years might be over exaggerating, but like it has been not the case for a long time. But it just, the same thing perpetuates for over and over and over and over again, and it continues over and over and over again. That now Bo is dealing with it, which makes absolutely no freaking sense.
Yeah, and like another thing is like Katana's safety. Since 2 years since then, we've had like a lot of to go into another double standard. Obviously, we had Type 2 Spiral since then, which I think is pretty safe to say Type 2 Spiral was probably the individual like most broken thing that has been in the game, just because
100%.
Like they put in a check in the game to stop subclass Katana and Knuckles, which was giving main class weapons, I think it was like a 20% damage boost in Ark's records.
Yep.
And then on top of that, you have just the baseline 10%. And then because they're like multiplicative, it comes out to the 30-something% bonus damage in an Ark's record for using your main class weapon. And yet, like, Force was doing its best subbing Sword for Type 2 Spiral. It was literally overwriting a 30% damage buff that was put in check to get the previously, oh my god, this is overpowered Katana in line. But the reason I bring that up is no one even cared. Like, though, like the speedrun community obviously was like losing their minds over it the entire time. But I've seen so many times people were like, what was wrong with Type 2 Spiral? I didn't even know that that was a thing. And it's just completely gone under the radar of just how unbelievably strong this move was compared to the rest of the game. But yet 2 years later, Braver's still paying for its past sins of being like a strong individual weapon.
Yep. It's silly. Absolutely silly.
And then finally, what was the other one I was going to say? Shoot, I forgot.
I thought this was the last one, honestly.
Well, it was another double standard, but it doesn't matter. I think people got the point. But
yeah, the reasons are stupid.
The reason I bring this up is also because just kind of, I do think community perception affects balance a lot.
100%.
I think Katana is literally an example of that on both ends of the spectrum. It got kind of complained about until it got buffed to the point that it was, and then it got complained about until it got ignored into obscurity. Like it's an exact example of the community does actually matter for getting stuff balanced.
Mhm.
And I think that that's especially important. I've been talking about Katana this entire time, but the reason I'm saying this is all of this kind of like braver drama and stuff directly affects Bo like the most. Bo has never had the time to even get a chance to be strong and get like really good quality of life because it's been dragged through the mud for going on 3 years soon now. And it just, because people are so on braver all the time for this stuff. um the reason I'm also bringing this up is like recently the recent headline announced the next few expansions. I think they said it was Fighters obviously in June, and then
Mhm.
Tectors in October, and then they said Force and Hunter. Well, if you look at previous patterns, there's 4 months between expansions. We have Fighter in June, Gunner and Ranger were back in February, and then 4 months before that was Bouncer.
Mhm.
So you add 4 months on, we're going to Tector in October. It's safe to assume they're not doing Hunter and Force together because they're nothing alike. So you're looking at Force in February of next year, Hunter in June of next year, and then who knows what's next? It might not even be Braver because it's based on popularity instead of like actual balance needs. We're looking for at least October 2025 for Bo to finally get anything.
Well, hard disagree. There's no guarantee it's based on popularity needs. Well, community perception does skew it 100%. I agree with that without a shadow of a doubt. Because this happened when they announced the first 2 sets, and
Yeah.
the number of people that blew their minds over it, they obviously don't care about this class. They don't care about it. It's gone. There's no way. Like, was insane to me. Someone's going to fall behind. No matter how you look at it. The only 2 classes that that legitimately don't get to say anything are Waker and Slayer. Like, if you're complaining, go home. Like, literally go home. You're the strongest classes in the freaking game. Get out. But like it's a situation where this is going to be the perception because they're not like, there's no information. They don't tell you, right? Like, they haven't told us exactly what the case is. You have to have behind the scenes information, and there isn't. And I can tell you from personal experience, there is no behind the scenes information that we currently have that tells us one way or another. But the reality is that Bo needs a lot of help, and we now know its expansion is far away at the moment, which definitely sucks. Nice to hear that Force is there, but I would argue Force is probably the only other class that's in the need of a renewal instead of just an expansion. Like, it's the only one that I'm like, people are like, oh, rework because Bouncer got one. Renewal, relax. But I would argue only Force really deserves that level of commitment in that situation itself, and it kind of sucks to hear it's only getting an expansion, but we'll have to see how that goes. But yeah, like, it does suck that it's far away. So I have to agree. Like I said, we can have moments of agreeing versus disagreeing, guys. It's the thing that happens. It's crazy to know. And I know it's insane to think about it, but we can disagree in that thought process itself. I don't think that's the reason. That might be the reason. Chumbo thinks it's the reason. Who knows? But at the end of the day, it still sucks because, yeah, realistically, you're probably not looking. You're not looking at anything till like 2025 at this point. Unless they spring it on you. Keep in mind that, like, roadmaps are not finite. They do be adding stuff randomly out of nowhere. So
I've lasted this long. I can keep waiting, but it's it's unfortunate to say the least.
I will tell you, as someone who thought he was being consistently ignored when it came to his weapon, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. They do pay attention, and I can tell you people always said, oh, creators have an extra line or something along. We do not. I promise you we don't. But what I can tell you is that community perception is huge. It is a very big part of it. And proper feedback is the other perspective. As much as people love to meme about the devs don't play their game, not every single dev plays every single class. That is not a thing that's ever going to happen. Just is not. It's not there. And 95% to like 98% of them do not play at the level that most of us play. Like, that's just the God honest truth. As much as you designing something means that you've designed it, does not mean that you're the best at using it or you're the best at doing it. So player feedback and community perception is insanely large. It's huge in this process. That's why we're doing these interviews. That's why I tell you guys, when you provide feedback, remember you're talking to a person at the other end, and screaming at that person is not going to get them to hear you. If anything, it's going to get them to ignore you faster, which I can personally tell you from experience does happen, not only in like this profession, but in all of them. And definitely when it comes to PSO2, that happens. Yeah. So please think when you speak. So the human perception part is a big thing, is big here. And enough, this interview is going to go a little bit longer than we than the original one, because there was a little bit more to talk about this time around. Which you might break the record, funny enough. The last thing I wanted to go into specifically was, and this is how we're going to kind of wrap things up, is what would you do with Bo? Like, what would you want to see change specifically with the class itself that would move you kind of in a more positive light? It can be outrageous. It can be, you know, what you feel like is reasonable, and you can always identify them as which is which.
So the first thing I would do, I didn't actually touch on these too much during this, the ceaseless crafts, and by extension the dim ray crafts. I'd like them to kind of relax a lot of the negatives that come with them. Like the potent, like type 1 ceaseless increases the attack speed of the PA, but like nerfs its damage. I think the damage nerf is really significant for what the PA still asks of you to do. A lot of times, like I said, it ends up being a loss if you're using, like, if you fit a ceaseless in beforehand and then you take the craft and you're now fitting in a ceaseless, but you're doing it at reduced potency and you're not fitting in an extra ceaseless, and what you're doing like within the same window afterwards isn't making up for the potency loss, you just kind of nerfed yourself. Stuff like that. Like, I think that they could do another pass on both PA's crafts just to make them a little more enticing, because like I said, if you're not using these optimally, like type 3 ceaseless is an absolute, like, you need like a spreadsheet for every possible move in the game on this thing for it to be worthwhile. It's horrible, but it is like a gain if you're using it right. I'd like for them to be a little more enticing so that you didn't need to do that to the same degree. I think it's nice in moderation, but to the degree that it is right now, for such a small increase in potency,
No,
that's something I'd like for them to change. Brave combat, I'd like for them to move the cooldown starting onto the first cast rather than on the finisher, so that like the second you press the first cast, it starts ticking down, so you can actually enjoy using the buff and you're not getting penalized for it. And then I'd like the hit count bonus for like doing damage during the buff to also affect the damage. I think it would reward like changing up your style during it, and it's kind of, that almost functions as like a miniature Banish Arrow that I think could help people get what they want out of that. Like, you know, a period where like, hey, I'm very strong during this, I want to hit a lot, and then it's going to blow up at the end for like damage based on how well I did during it. Like, I think that's a good middle ground to reach on that.
I thought that's a reasonable ask, by the way. That, I feel like that's the bare minimum of what it should actually be personally, but
yeah. I'd like charge flex to have a sort of like a self benefit, like where if the first hit of your flex is hitting a weak point, the rest hits the same weak point, so that you're just not losing half your damage for no reason for like the piercing. Filler PAs, I'd like to see them buff in potency or speed or both. On charge flex especially, like I mentioned, very slow, very weak, and you don't have an option to use anything but it half the time. I had mentioned this last time and I still kind of want to stick to it, and I think you had thought it was funny, but then I kind of explained it. A gap close.
Oh yeah, we did talk about that and kind of how that would be. It took me a little while to get on board for that one, because I was like, I don't know why that would matter as much, but like the way you explained it does make sense. So I'll go ahead and let you go into it.
So like I had mentioned it briefly earlier with AMs for people that were listening to that, but also for like Didals and stuff. If you're playing from range and you're like in party play, you have melees up on like their chest or something, beating the crap out of them. And you have a shot on his weak point on his chest. Well, you're playing from range because you want long range advantage. You don't care about counters at this point. he turns around, the melees are right back onto his weak point in the matter of a second, but you have to run across a football field to get back to the spot, and you don't have a gap close to do that. Uncharged Ceaseless moves you, but it's still slow. Like, it's not faster than photon dashing. You have to literally just stop attacking and start sprinting if you want to get back to the weak spot. I think that having an interesting gap closer would fix that. I understand that's an ask, but it's something that I think would help in team play.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the bigger issue in that situation, and it's, I mean, it could be a situation where someone disagrees with like the mindset behind this,
Yeah.
but I always believe your counter should be your strongest option. I feel like having your counter not be your strongest option is just really awkward.
Yeah.
Especially with how the game is designed. So like where you're looking for perspective of like you needed to be wrapped around, my thought process will make counter strong enough to the point where you would want to be up there on the target's face, because you want to get all those counters and you want to be able to do that. And while you've got a really cool 5-second draw time shot, that really should be, in my opinion, reserved for like really cool setups and things of that sort, not like your highest freaking option thing to do across the entire map. That seems silly.
That's like I like Ceaseless a lot because of there are windows, like finding Ceaseless windows is one of the funnest parts of bows. Like when you have a boss on you and you're like, where in this boss can I fit a Ceaseless? And finding those and actually being successful with them is like a really just, it's very interesting, and like it feels rewarding, as much as rewarding as bow can be, but like it feels good to do that. But then again, it's in moderation. You're finding those individual moments to use it, but then when you go to those like long range things, you're literally just doing nothing but pressing this move, and it just kind of is boring and not interesting. I don't feel rewarded. Nothing is different. It's the exact same thing every time. It's just not something I particularly think is good design.
Yeah, like it creates a very weird situation. Like I literally had a limited quest today where we chain knocked down the hell out of Croc. Like from the start, like from the first knockdown, I think he was at like 80% HP, and he was at 10 by the time he finally got a chance to get up. Like those moments of being able to spam the same thing over and over again, like that's cool because that's the one time that happens. But like, if that was everything all the time, no matter what, and I'm not dealing with anything else like that, I could see how that would be like really kind of like lame. Like you wouldn't really care about those moments.
The next thing, I think this is actually a pretty interesting thing. Giving illusion and illusion EX to attack impact. So for people that don't know, I actually haven't brought this up super often in this, but illusion and illusion EX, when Bo uses a PA, you can hold a directional and use a weapon action, and you'll slide in that direction and shoot like a little shot while you do it that like does a little bit of damage and regens PP. That's illusion, I think, or it might be illusion plus, I don't remember. But then illusion EX is if during that slide you get hit by something, you can then use it as a counter. So that gives you like an iframe. You can like slide into stuff and then counter. Right now, and that's like your optimal counter. Like you always want to line up that slide. So you always want to line up an attack coming at you with immediately after finishing a PA, so you can slide into it rather than just do a standing weapon action. When you use the attack impact normal, you can't do that. Like your weapon action is just going to be a standing weapon action. You don't have the slide. And I think that can be really awkward, and it kind of like ruins flow. Like Ikasabujan, you can probably see that a couple times where like he does like that 3-hit combo, and you'll see like uncharged flex, slide counter, uncharged flex, slide counter, uncharged flex, slide counter, normal attack for attack impact, and then you just kind of stand there awkwardly and then space or just do a standing counter and then go back to doing what you were doing. I think that adding illusion and illusion EX after that would add a little more fluidity and a little more DPS to the attack impact normal that I said was kind of taking down, like diluting the potency that it adds. So something like that I think would be a really smooth way to improve that skill.
That's fair.
Remove long range advantage. Just get rid of it.
Disagree, but go on.
Just remove it and put the damage on the rest of the kit.
I can take that. I can take that. I think that's fair, because that does remove reliance on things like Ranger and so on and so forth. I think it's kind of silly that they added that specific. I'm not sure why that was done. Like,
yeah, it's
they could have just buffed range classes across the board. I don't think anyone would have complained all that much, to be honest. I think we would have been okay with it. That's what I thought. Fun fact for those of us who didn't know, long range advantage does not affect the entire kit. And I know a lot of melee players like myself had no idea it doesn't affect your entire kit, because that doesn't make any goddamn sense.
yeah.
Why would it not affect your entire kit? But yeah, so okay, fair. You know what? That's fine. Just give the damage across the board and tune it for each class, each weapon individually. That's fine. I can agree with that.
Then wide dim ray, the type 1 craft for dimensional ray, maybe not to the same size as it, but I do think that they should just make the size of wide dim ray the default for the rain. Maybe like half of wide dim ray, because even then I think that's bigger than current dim ray. Just make it so that it's just a little bit more consistent by default. And then just change the type 1 craft to something else. Or if you don't even go all the way, just leave the type 1 as it is so that you can get even more range if you want it. But I just, in general, give dimensional rays range a little bit more, just so like an enemy, like I think in my Geolab video, actually, there was a point where like Engoku dashes and he's like right out of a dim ray. He's like, his toes are touching the ring of it and he's just not taking any damage from it.
That
Because
sucks.
it's just small enough that his dash is long enough that he doesn't get affected by it anymore. If you just made it just very slightly bigger, it would be so much more usable by default. And then if you want wide dim ray for the funny haha, it's bigger, take it. Bows crafts in general kind of suffer just for like PP costs, because like I said, they're different moves that have different applications, but the craft's PP demerits affect the entire PA. So like you get wide dim ray for the rain. Oh, I want to stock arrows from charged. It costs more PP, even though it's not doing anything different. Stuff like that. Hope maybe they can find a solution to that. I don't know. Just remove that if you can. And that's really it. I think the last thing I had mentioned last time was just like a want rather than things that I think would improve the weapon, just like a cool active skill.
Yeah, I could say that would be fair. I think fixing your current active skill would be kind of important, but like the fact you don't have an equivalent of like opinion or something like that, like it's a bit strange. So yeah, no, that's fair.
I think Bo had like it was Cerulean Ballista in base, which I think they kind of baked into Brave Combat. Like Brave Combat is kind of like, it looks almost exactly like one of the variations of Cerulean Ballista. So I think they kind of like said, oh, this is this and it's whatever. But I don't know. There's like a lot of cool like power fantasy moments of pressing that button. Like I'm sure you feel a whole bunch of power when you're like loading up that pinion and it crits and you hit like a truck and you're just like, oh, that felt really great.
Oh yeah, when it crits and you finally hit with it after you wait 3.5 million years to swing it. But yeah, no, for sure.
I know like Wired Lance got one somewhat recently as well. Something feathers. I can't remember the name of it, but something like that. That would be like just like a side one that I'd want eventually down the line if they want to add something cool. But yeah, that's really it for stuff that I'd say to fix.
I think that's fair. Nothing else is too outlandish. I can definitely get behind the most of the Brave Combat change. I think the cooldown thing, I don't mind the kind of give and take there, but the fact that there's not a build up with like, you get nothing with the count seems really, really bad. So like that I can definitely understand that much, and most of everything else there kind of tracks. So I'm good with that. I feel like that's definitely something that's fair. It's nothing too outlandish, honestly. Like you could have asked for some pretty crazy stuff. Like give Bo a melee combo that way I go into melee for some reason. Don't do that. That's a joke. But you know, that sort of thing, definitely something we can look at, or something should be looked at, in my opinion. But that kind of takes us towards our end of our interview here. Before we wrap things up, was there like any shout outs you wanted to give out? Or of course, as always, all important and pertinent information will be posted in the video description, links and stuff like that. But any individuals you wanted to shout out, or anything in particular that you're working on that you wanted to go ahead and talk about?
Yeah, so first I'd like to shout out, I guess, Unicorn. He's a friend of mine. He plays Slayer. He had a Braver arc a while ago. He actually did an Alio Purple with Braver. He had a really good time on that. He helps me a lot with like doing math stuff, figuring out rotations, what can fit. He's been a pretty big supporter of pure bow, so I really appreciate that. Ondine for helping me with the guide, and he also kind of helped me when I first getting started out on bow. So he's been a really great resource for really starting to get to learn how to optimize. He was like there with me when I did the first Stia Purple that I did, which was the very first kind of like time attack thing I did. And then in general, just like the speedrunning community, the bravers out there, they've all been a great help. For the most part, everyone's very supportive of pure bow. They help provide like a lot of really good resources. I don't know if people have seen the leaderboard website that people like upload runs to and all that. Keeping like arch record information updated, all that. I think it's great. So shout outs to them. And then I guess this is going to sound corny, but to all the people out there that still believe in pure bow, good on you.
No, I don't think it sounds corny at all. Like it's to have the people still believe in your weapon itself, to know that you have kindred spirits out there that are kind of fighting that sort of fight with you it's definitely, you know, it seems kind of silly, right? Like, but like, yeah. It's a good feeling altogether. So I totally feel that.
Yeah. And then one more shout out to every person that's ever typed buff bow into chat. You're a real one.
Oh God, let's hope it doesn't turn into Buff Fighter from base PSO2. For those of you who know, you know. But I do want to thank you for joining me on this one. I think we actually did break the record. I think this is the longest one now for interviews itself, because we did have a lot more to talk about. There was more that changed. And of course, since we've had conversation in the past, I felt like there was more that I could add to, kind of back and forth. So that was a good conversation. As I mentioned, all pertinent information will be linked in the video description below. If not, if anything does get missed, expect the description to get updated or possibly a pinned comment. I'm sure Chumbo will be checking out the comments as well in case there's anything you guys want to ask. Be civil is all I ever ask of you guys down there. Be kind to one another. We all want everything to be fun, right? Like, that's the mindset here. We want to all have a good time. So everyone might not agree on that, but we can all be respectful to one another's opinions. That's not a difficult process to do.
And also, for any comment you make on this video, regardless of what the comment is, make sure you add buff bow to the end of it.
Oh my God, my entire comment section is going to say buff bow. So yeah, there you go. For every one buff bow, that's one more power that Chumbo gets. So that's, you know, you actually making him more powerful. It's the spirit bomb version of this for Bow Braver mains. Congratulations, you've created this. But yeah, thanks for joining me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm bad at doing outros, as I always have been. Do all the cool YouTube things. It does help out a ton. And keep I'm not sure what our next interview is going to be, but stay tuned. I think it might be Slayer, actually. We'll have to see. So stay tuned for that one. We should have that one up pretty soon. Anyway, take care, my friends.
See you later.
Peace out.